Welcome everybody to another event of the Conference on Cognitive Computational Neuroscience. The CCN conference exists in large part because of the sustained efforts by the Executive and Communication Committee, consisting of Thomas Naselaris, Henrik Nienborg, Russ Poldrak, and Kendrick Kay. This year's program was organized by the 2021 Program Committee with the two chairs, Gunnar Blom and Megan Peters, and consisting of Jana Jones, Ralph Heffner, Gemma Roy, Carlos Pons, Laila Isaac, and Jennifer Lieberman. Carlos Pons and Ralph Heffner, that's me, are your hosts for today's keynote and tutorial session. So before we go there, just want to give a brief overview. Many of you will have heard this already, so I'll try to keep it brief. The program this year really consists of two kinds of events: generative adversarial collaborations, keynotes and tutorials, and the Orgonotes event. Generative adversarial collaborations really were started last year already, and so this is the second generation, and they're an effort by the by CCN to bring together teams of scientists with opposing theories and hypotheses or views on the same question, to first organize a workshop as part of the CCN conference, then write a position paper that lays out the controversy or debate, and then hopefully providing the seed for a longer term collaboration that can then answer or address the controversy using data. And you can find out more about this at the GAC site that's linked off the main CCN website. The Argonauts is an event that happened for the first time this year and modeled on some machine learning competitions, trying to provide a way for researchers to compare their models on how well they can predict the responses of humans or fMRI responses to humans watching dynamic videos. Again, this event has already happened, but you can find out more about this and how to participate for next year on the Argonaut site, also linked to CCN. Today's event is a keynote and tutorial, which is a new event that we put on this year. And I will be saying more about this in a moment. So just an overview over what has happened already. So there were several GAC workshops that have happened already. The last one yesterday, but there is one more. So I want to draw your attention to the last one, what makes representations useful, that will happen exactly 1 week from today. So I encourage you to join that. Again, you can find out more about this as well as videos of past events linked from the CCN website. Now, keynote and tutorials. What is this really about? And it's a new event or that we created this year with the goal of improving on the existing keynote format that has been around for a very long time and as part of every conference, to not just show cool neuroscience but also give a deeper view on how it comes about, to basically look under the hood and get more exposure to the technical details. And so one way to do that, and that's what we're trying to do here, is by following up each keynote with a tutorial on the methods or the data set that went into the science that's presented during that keynote speech. And our goal really is, or our hope is, that this will enable groups beyond the ones that contributed to the work going into the keynote speech to carry out similar analyses themselves, like today. Get a better understanding of the method that's being used or proposed, or in other cases, get a better understanding of the data set that gave rise to the science that's being presented, and maybe perform your own analyses on that data set. Okay, So we already had two such keynote and tutorial events. So today is the third and last one of this year's conference. The first one was on voxel-wise modeling, September 13. The second one on controversial stimuli in order to optimize experiments to differentiate between different models. In this case, primarily deep learning models as models for the brain. And today, of course, flexible identification on population dynamics from neural activity recordings. Okay. Again, if you've missed the last two, you can find them on YouTube, linked from CCN. And also, I should say that today's meeting is being recorded, which Zoom hopefully alerted you to. Okay, so with no further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tatiana Engel and Mikhail Genkin, who will be giving today's keynote and tutorial speech. Tatiana Engel got her PhD in theoretical physics from Humboldt University in Berlin before she became a postdoc in George Wang's lab at Yale University, and from there moved to Thierry Moore's lab at Stanford. And since 2017, she's led her own group at the Cold Spring Harbor lab. Mikhail Genkin got a PhD also in physics at Northwestern University before he moved to Tatiana Engel's lab, where he's now a postdoc and contributed much of the work that's been presented today. And he'll be leading the tutorial. Okay. Oh, I forgot to stop sharing. So Tatiana, please take over from here. Maybe one point I should say is that this is run like a normal Zoom meeting, which means that if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. With power comes responsibility. Make sure to mute yourself when you're not asking a question. But we really want to encourage participation and in this event. Okay, thank you, Tatiana.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ralph, for the nice introduction and for this opportunity to present in the keynote and tutorial today. My name is Tatiana Engel. I will be giving the keynote, and Mikhail Genkin will then explain in details all the methods associated with our work, which he performed in my lab, and give a hands-on tutorial on the software package, which we released recently. The work I will talk about today was done in collaboration with Chandrasekharan from Boston University and Krishna Shenoy at Stanford University, who kindly provided us with experimental data about which I will talk today. It's a small group, so I would like to make it as interactive as possible. So please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and ask a question anytime during the presentation if anything is unclear, or otherwise you can also put a question in the chat, and Ralph or Carlos will read those questions to me. All right, so maybe it's not a secret for anyone in this meeting that over a few recent years, we have seen an explosion of experimental tools for recording neural activity from hundreds or even thousands of neurons simultaneously. And the broad availability of such large-scale recordings led to great advances in our understanding of how neural populations represent behaviorally relevant signals. While the classical theories focused on how single neurons encode stimuli with a tuning curve, which show how firing rate of a single neuron changes as a function of a stimulus, now on the level of the whole population, we used to think about those representations in a high-dimensional space where each axis corresponds to activity of an individual neuron. A point in this neural space represents a population state, which reflects simultaneous activity of all the neurons. Different stimuli will correspond to different population states, and changes of stimulus will induce coordinated activity changes across the population as defined by the combination of tuning curves of all neurons. These activity patterns can be very high dimensional. They can include hundreds and thousands of neurons. But if stimulus is low dimensional, the population activity will trace out a low dimensional manifold encoding the stimulus in the high dimensional neural state space. Examples of such population codes exist in sensory and motor systems, where we can vary the parameters of a stimulus or movement and map out corresponding changes in the neural population state. For example, orientation of a visual grating stimulus is a one-dimensional circular variable. Individual neurons in the primary visual cortex are tuned to the orientation, and tuning curves of different neurons span the stimulus range. In the population space, neural responses will be organized on a circle, which smoothly represents the stimulus orientation. As we move along this circle in the neural population space, the activity of every individual neuron changes according to its tuning curve. So the nonlinear tuning curves jointly define the shape of the stimulus manifold in the neural population space. However, neural responses reflect not only external stimuli, which we can easily observe, but also internal cognitive variables, which we cannot directly observe in an experiment. These latent cognitive variables are especially interesting because they reflect cognitive computations, transforming sensory inputs into motor actions. An example of such a cognitive computation is decision-making. When we make a perceptual decision, we need to convert a sensory stimulus into a categorical choice. For example, in this experiment performed by our collaborators, Chand and Krishna, a monkey needs to choose either the red or green target, depending on the dominant color in a checkerboard stimulus composed of red and green squares. Such binary decision computation can be described by a one-dimensional decision variable, which represents the evidence accumulated in favor of one or another choice option. Although the accumulated evidence is a key component in most behavioral models of decision-making, we still don't know how it is represented in the brain. Unlike sensory tuning, there are several factors which make it challenging to identify the latent dynamics of cognitive variables. First, the decisions unfold with unique time course on single trials. We can register the final choice which the animal makes when the latent decision trajectory reaches one of the decision boundaries, but we cannot directly observe or control the decision time course, and therefore we cannot reconstruct the decision trajectory simply by averaging neural activity over multiple trials. Second, it is unclear what equations control the dynamics of the decision process. Behavioral models usually assume that the decision follows a drift diffusion process. In this model, the latent decision variable x is driven by two contributions. One is drift, mu, which describes a systematic drift of decision process towards one of the decision boundary, and mu will depend on the stimulus strength. For stronger, more obvious stimuli, the drift towards the boundary will be stronger. And the second component is noise, or diffusion process, which describes variability in the decision time course. This model can capture the speed and accuracy of decisions accurately, and moreover, it resembles some of the features of neural activity. For example, if we simulate drift diffusion process over multiple trials and compute trial average activity of this diffusion process, then what we will see will be a ramping activity, as shown here. And the slope of this ramping activity will depend on the stimulus strength. For easier stimuli, the trial average response will ramp faster towards the corresponding decision boundary. Interestingly, if we average spiking activity of neurons during the decision process, in multiple areas we can find neurons which will show similar time course of their trial average firing rates. It seems to suggest that most likely, possibly, the drift diffusion process is what underlies the dynamics of these neural responses. But however, we're only looking here in trial average activity on single trials, the picture can be more complex. Indeed, it was pointed out previously that the same trial average responses can arise from many different kinds of spike patterns on single trials, and ramping or drift diffusion process is just one possibility of how this spike in activity can arise on single trials. For example, we can imagine another scenario where activity lingers in an undecided state for a variable period of time and then almost instantaneously transitions to a different state representing the decision. If these jumps in neural activity occur at different times on different trials, then on average, we can also see ramping activity. But clearly, this is a very different model of decision computation compared to a drip diffusion process. Dissociating between these two models was not easy, but we also see a limitation of this traditional approach of model selection because we focus only on two specific possibilities, but you can imagine a great variety of other types of dynamics, which may be also plausible to explain decision-related activity, but they're just not included in this small set of discrete alternatives which we consider. And moreover, if we explore responses of many individual neurons, if we look even in their trial average firing rates, this ramping activity is actually not so common. Responses of neurons are very heterogeneous, and although canonical ramping responses can be found, many neurons show more complex time courses with activity rising and then decaying through the decision time course. And it remains so far unclear how to reconcile this heterogeneity of single neurons responses with the common decision computation performed by the entire population. So of course, we could imagine that similar to sensory stimuli, cognitive variables, such as the decision process, could evolve on a low-dimensional manifold in neural population space. And then firing rates of different neurons will depend on coordinates along this manifold with their unique tuning functions. Just like individual neurons in the visual cortex have different orientation tuning curves. However, reconstructing these dynamics and idiosyncratic tuning of individual neurons to latent cognitive variables remains an open challenge. To address this challenge, we need to solve several problems. First, we will have to reconstruct neural population dynamics on single trials. Second, we need to discover the model of dynamics from data rather than assume very rigid a priori models such as ramping or stepping. And finally, we need to identify heterogeneous relationships between firing rates of single neurons and the latent population state, which would be an analog of a tuning curve in sensory system. This is what our work aimed to do. And in today's presentation, I will first show you a framework which we developed to address these issues. It is a flexible and intrinsically interpretable framework for modeling neural population dynamics. And when we started to work with this framework, we realized that the classical model selection approaches are not sufficient to identify models with correct interpretation. And I will show you a new method which we developed to select models based on their feature consistency. And in the final part of my talk, I will describe how we use this method on recordings from the primate motor dorsal premotor cortex, or PMD, data recorded by Chan and Krishna, and what insights we got into decision computation using our method. All right, so if we want to build a very flexible model, then we should be able to capture many different kinds of dynamics in the same model architecture. How can we do it? Imagine you have complex trajectories in your low-dimensional latent space. To understand the structure of those trajectories would be easy if we knew the equation of motion which generated these dynamics. In this equation, the evolution of the latent variable x is described by a general dynamical system equation with a deterministic force and a stochastic force represented noise in the system. The regularity in the motion of the trajectories can be captured by force, or you can think about it as a particle moving in a potential landscape, where the wells corresponds to the attractors of the dynamics. So the particle will be attracted towards valleys, and it has harder time climbing up the hills in this landscape. In multiple dimensions, there will be not only potential forces, there could also be rotational forces or curl flux. But because for the whole talk today, we'll focus on one-dimensional dynamics, the curl will not be part of our equations. So now, if you could imagine that you can take this potential landscape and you can morph it in a smooth and continuous way to any shape, then with this equation, you would be able to represent many different kinds, qualitatively different types of dynamics. So our goal would be then to learn the shape of this landscape from data, and this is exactly what our framework is designed to do. We model neural population dynamics in a low-dimensional latent state using these general dynamical system equations. And the second requirement which we have, we need to account for heterogeneous responses of individual neurons. And therefore, each point in this latent space maps to firing activity of individual neuron through a unique firing rate function, about which you can think that it is like a tuning curve of these neurons to the latent variable which we try to reconstruct. And to account for variability of spiking responses in individual neurons, we also have a Poisson component, which then maps instantaneous firing rate of every neuron to a point process. So our goal would be using the observed spike data to reconstruct all components in this framework, which include idiosyncratic firing rate functions of every individual neuron, and the forces and noise magnitude in this latent dynamical system. All these functions will be represented by continuous functions, and they can be changed in continuous ways. So we will be using gradient descent optimization, which will be optimizing these continuous functions in a space of continuous functions. So you can think about it as we morphing those functions in different shapes. And in this way, this framework allows us the flexibility to capture different kinds of dynamics and very different kinds of relationships between dynamics and activity of individual neurons. First, I will illustrate to you how this framework operates, and I will use synthetic data for this. This is a synthetic population which we simulated. It has 16 neurons, and we only have access to spiking activity of these neurons to reconstruct the latent population state. And all neurons follow just this simple one-dimensional trajectory shown here in gray, which alternates between two states corresponding to high and low activity of the population. Before showing you how our framework solves this problem, I will compare it to usual parametric approaches, which start with some a priori assumptions about the dynamics and just estimate parameters from data. For example, if we were given this data with two discrete states in the ground truth dynamics, we could assume that a good model would be a Gaussian process factor analysis model, a model commonly used in neuroscience, GPFA. And we could feed this model to the data, and the fundamental assumption of this model is that latent dynamics are smooth and evolved with a particular time constant. And you can see that although the data clearly exhibit transitions in the ground truth dynamics, the GPFA will feel smooth wiggles to these discontinuous dynamics. On the other hand, we could maybe guess the right model to feed this data, for example, hidden Markov model, which starts with the opposite assumption. It assumes that dynamics discontinuously jump between two discrete states. And because we happen to make right assumptions, in this case, HMM accurately reconstructs these discontinuous transitions. If data, however, was generated not from the discontinuous jumping process, but from the smoothly evolving Gaussian process, which is closer to the GPFA assumptions, the GPFA would most accurately reconstruct this process, but HMM, in contrast, will still find discrete transitions in this continuous data. And this problem is hard to solve with a classical parametric model selection, because for model selection, these models, they both fit the data reasonably well, and distinguishing which of them actually underlies the ground truth is very difficult. In contrast, our framework can find discrete transitions in the data where the ground truth dynamics was actually showing discrete transitions, but it's also not fooled and can accurately reconstruct continuous Gaussian trajectory when it is the case in the synthetic data. So how our framework achieves this flexibility to model both smooth and discontinuous dynamics? It is because dynamics can be captured by the shape of the potential landscape. These discontinuous switching dynamics correspond to potential landscape, which has two discrete attractors. And trajectory will linger around one attractor, and then driven by noise, occasionally transition to another attractor, giving appearance to sharp switches in the trajectory. On the other hand, if we had dynamics with just a single attractor, then fluctuations around this single attractor will produce a smooth, continuous trajectory. We learn the shape of this potential landscape directly from spiking data. Here, I will show you a video where we use a gradient descent optimization to find the correct potential shape. So in this video, the gray line shows a double well potential corresponding to switching dynamics. And it is a ground truth from which the spiking data was generated. And the red line will show the model guess or model current estimate about the potential shape and how it is changing over the gradient descent estimations. You can see that starting from an unspecific single well potential, over iteration of the gradient descent, the potential shape smoothly changes until it comes close to the ground truth model. And at the same time, as we learn the dynamics of potential shape, we can also learn simultaneously the firing rate functions which connect single neurons to the population dynamics. Here an example of optimization where I show you just one neuron from which this potential shape was learned, and we learn the shape of the firing rate function simultaneously with potential. So that was great. So we developed this framework and we wanted to use it to understand the data, but then we encountered a problem with this flexible. On one hand, we gained the model flexibility, but we encountered an unexpected problem, which led us to work more on model selection.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Isn't it kind of a strong assumption to assume that the dynamics are like correspond to the existence of some potential function?
In one dimension, in most cases, it is true. So like in one dimension, if you don't have circular domain, you will not have flux. In multiple dimension, not all dynamics can be described by potential. So there is this additional flow fields, which can give you rotational dynamics. And for the most part, as you will also learn in tutorial, we use potential for visualization because it's very interpretable. But in reality, we are learning force field, and the force can have both potential component or conservative forces in it, but it also can have these rotational forces. So the framework in itself is not limited to learning only the potential shape. So it can learn other force fields, which also have non-conservative or rotational motion in it. But for the purpose of these talks, because we are only talking about one-dimensional dynamics, these rotational forces become irrelevant. So we only focus on visualizing potential.
But so follow-up question. Should I think of this latent state construction and the construction of the potential function in the curl, flow field, whatever? Should I think of this as what's actually happening, or some kind of like useful latent state for modeling the data?
It's the equation in themselves is just a general dynamical system equation. So if you can write down a dynamical system in one dimension, we will be able to capture it with this model. So we like to plot potential because it's very interpretable to us. We have all the dynamical system tools to understand the shape of these potentials. For example, we know that the wells correspond to attractors, and trajectory will try to stick to those attractors. But in itself, equations are very general, and any one-dimensional dynamics you can write down could be written down in this form. All right, so I was about to tell you that we encountered an unexpected problem when working with such a flexible model. So when I previously showed you a fitting video, I stopped the video at a particular iteration of gradient descent. It was iteration 530. And at that moment, the potential was very close to the ground truth. But in principle, there was no reason for me to stop optimization, because the gradient descent would still increase the model likelihood if we continue optimization. But what you can see in this video is that if we keep fitting the model starts to develop features which are not present in the ground truth, which we call spurious features. And of course, this is a problem because interpretation of our model changes completely. Now, instead of 2 attractor states present in the ground truth data, we would discover 3 states, which is, of course, is a problem. Here is another illustration of this. If we optimize our model and improve the model likelihood over multiple iterations of the gradient descent, first we will learn simple features in the model until we recover ground truth, but at later stages we start to develop spurious features. This is a well-known problem. It's a problem of overfitting. Obviously, we try to reconstruct this latent dynamics from a finite sample of discrete and very noisy spikes. The model tries to explain the spike data as good as possible, and therefore these little wiggles in the potential which develop try to best fit the noise in the model. So what happens, trying to mimic every aspect of the data which the model was given, it starts to develop spurious features overfitting to noise in spiking sequence. The usual response to overfitting is, of course, validation. So we should just take a different sample of spike data, which was not used for fitting the model, and then evaluate every model which we discovered during gradient descent optimization on this new sample of data. And this is an orange curve shown here. This is a validated log likelihood. One feature which immediately strikes you if you look in this graph, that there is a long plateau in both training and validation curves. It means that all these different models, which obviously have different features and different interpretation, generalize nearly equally well. The spurious features in those models develop on top of the correct features, which are discovered first. And the spurious features don't harm the model's ability to predict new data. Indeed, spike trains generated from overfitted models are statistically very similar to the spike trains generated from the ground truth model. So usually we would like to pick the model which generalizes best, which corresponds to the minimum in the validated log likelihood. But if we would do so, we would often find models which are badly overfitted. If our goal was just to predict new data or have a model which have very good likelihood on a new data sample, we achieved our goal. Any of those models would predict new data well. However, our goal is to interpret the model which we discover. And clearly for interpretation of the model, this is a big problem, because if we choose the model for its generalization ability, we can frequently find models with spurious features. So if we repeat this exercise over multiple samples of training and validation data, sometimes validation-based model selection performs well, and we are lucky to recover the model which will match the ground truth closely, but often we will find that the model selected by validation has spurious features. This behavior is not unique to our framework. It's actually common in other flexible models, such as deep neural networks, for which it was also shown that first they learn simple model features, and then they start to develop spurious features, which nevertheless don't harm the model's ability to predict new data. This phenomenon has now been explored quite a bit in the machine learning field as well. So in our case, because we really were interested to find interpretable models, we had to develop a procedure for model selection, which will not be based on the model's generalization, but which should be targeted towards discovering correct features of the model. And to do this, we reasoned that when we optimize the models, what happens that model discovers features of the dynamics. And if we took two samples of the data, then the true dynamical features, which would be discovered on these two samples, would be the same. But overfitting patterns will be very different, and they will be unique to every data sample because the noise is unique in any particular realization of spike sequence. So we thought what we should do instead, we should compare features discovered on different data samples. However, if we run gradient descent optimization, the same features are discovered at different iterations on different data samples. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to compare the model at the same iteration number because we would be comparing very different models. Some of them already developed 3 wells and some are just in the very beginning and have just a single well. So we needed a procedure to align features of the model across data samples. To do so, we developed a metric called feature complexity, which is a negative entropy of trajectories generated in a particular potential shape. And when we compute this metric over the course of gradient descent iteration, what we observed is that the feature complexity rises continuously as more and more features develop in the potential. So initially, we always start with a simple potential shape, and then more and more structure is learned in the potential, which is reflected as increase in feature complexity. And the dashed line here corresponds to the ground truth complexity of the potential from which the data was generated. So initially, we are learning the true features of the model, but at some point, we exceed this ground truth complexity, and we start to overfit to noise in the training data. On different data samples, the discovered models will cross the ground truth feature complexity on different iterations of the gradient descent. However, we can align all those models along the feature complexity axis. What you see here is a validated negative log likelihood as a function of feature complexity. And you can see that as a validated likelihood is still decreasing, the feature complexity can increase beyond the point, which I call here M star, which corresponds to the ground truth model complexity. So if we picked two models which are simple and are of the same complexity early in the optimization, then those features would overlap between two data samples very closely. If on the other hand, we go to this overfitting phase late in the optimization, then the features of the same complexity discovered on different data samples would diverge because overfitting patterns are very idiosyncratic. And at the ground truth model complexity is the last point where the potential discovered on different data samples still agree with each other. So we developed an algorithm which can sweep through this complexity axis and find the last point until the potentials discovered on different data samples still agree. And we showed that using this approach, we can accurately recover interpretable model with correct features across different types of dynamics. Here is one example, just to illustrate that this is a simulation where we use 10 independent data samples, and the dots show the minimum in the validated log likelihood, and lines show the corresponding potential shape. So model selection based on best validation doesn't work. It doesn't give us correctly interpretable model. While in contrast, our feature consistency method reliably recovers the correct shape of the potential.
Can I ask you a question?
Mm-hmm.
Tatiana, so if you go back one slide, is this equivalent to having a prior on smoothness and setting the hyperparameter for your smoothness according to your validation?
Not exactly. So we show this in the paper as well. So the common way is to regularize your optimization. Why don't you use just some smoothness prior? But you have to tune the strengths of the regularization, right? There is always a hyperparameter which defines how much should you weight your model likelihood relative to your smoothness prior? Now, how do we usually find the strengths of the regularizer? Usually by cross-validation, right? So if you don't want to build in a priori assumption of how smooth of a model you want to find, and we didn't want to build it because we don't know how simple or complex the dynamics will be, which we want to discover from data. If we just start to tune the strengths of this hyperparameter by cross-validation, we see exact same behavior. Sometimes you get it right, but sometimes you get an overfitted model.
So, but this is equivalent then, no? I mean, you basically, you have a hyperparameter, you optimize the hyperparameter according to your performance on the validation set.
This is not exactly what we do in feature consistency approach, is not relying on validation log likelihood anymore. We give up idea of validation completely. We have a data set, we will divide it into halves. But instead of training on one half and validating on another half, we will train the model on both half of the data. And then we have a series of models discovered from different data halves. And what we will do, we will compare features of these two, between these two sets of models. And those features which are consistent between data samples, we call them the true features. And those features which will diverge as spurious features.
I mean, to me, it seems, sorry, that you have this S of phi, which is a measure of the model complexity. And you're finding the point at which, you know, basically you trade off model complexity and log likelihood, and you find the point where log likelihood, you know, basically doesn't improve anymore. And
oh, sorry, like I just want to classify. This is not. Sorry, I didn't show all the details going into this method. It's not how we find this point. We don't put it as a king in this curve or anything. What we literally do, we sweep through this entire axis of feature complexity. And at each level of feature complexity, we have a metric which describes how closely the models discovered on data samples overlap. And what you will see is that when we get to this point of the ground truth complexity, this metric starts to shoot up, indicating that the potential starts to diverge. So what we are measuring how well those potentials discovered on different data sample, how well do they agree? So we don't put it at the king of this curve. Maybe it's confusing about this plot.
Okay, but then you could still have overfitting, right? Because your potential that you discover by fitting to the entire set of data may, you know, I mean, will reflect idiosyncrasies of the spike train generation process.
But it's very unlikely to have exactly the same overfitting pattern on two different data samples. So the wiggles which we'll discover in different data samples will be idiosyncratic.
Okay, and so this you have different data samples. Okay, I get it.
Exactly, yeah. So we have two different data samples. We learn the model twice, and we only keep those features which are consistent across data samples. Does it make more sense? All right, sounds good.
Can I ask another question? Could you go back to the previous slide? So does the feature complexity measure depend on the potential function?
So for stationary dynamics, it's only depend on potential function. But in the next part of the talk, I will go to non-stationary dynamics. And in that case, it will depend on multiple components, on the initial distribution of trajectories, on the potential shape and noise magnitude.
So I was going to ask for a higher dimensional latent state. Is this still true?
Well, the non-stationary version of the feature complexity matrix, which kind of looks, so the feature complexity matrix which we use is the entropy of the distribution of trajectories generated by our model. So in a higher dimensional space, the distribution of these trajectories is controlled not only by potential, but by other rotational forces, for example, as well. So, but we still can capture it within the same metric, but the calculation of this metric will be different. So the same is true if you consider stationary or non-stationary dynamics. If you have stationary dynamics, it's just the shape of the potential. The metric is still the same, but calculation of this metric depends on the details of your dynamics. So for example, if you have time-dependent dynamics, like during decision-making, then calculation will also involve details like initial distribution of your trajectories and so on.
Thank you.
All right, so at this point, we are ready to move on to apply our framework to learn about how neurons in dorsal premotor cortex perform the decision computation. As I already alluded, decision-making is slightly different from what we considered so far, because decision process has a beginning and an end. When trial starts, there is a particular state of the system when monkey is ready to look at the stimulus. And when trial ends, in this case, we modeled the reaction time task. The end of the trial is determined not by experimenter, but by the animal itself. Or we can think that the brain area from which we record, because it generated neural activity likely leading to the decision outcome, that the state of this neural population will dictate when trial ends. To be able to account for this non-stationarity of decision process, we had to extend our framework by including additional components such as initial state distribution, P0 effects. This is the distribution of latent state at the beginning of the trial. And also we have boundaries in our domain, such that then when latent state reaches a boundary, trial is terminated. And we had to do it because it's a reaction time task, and we simply have no spikes observation anymore after the animal commits to a choice, because decision is done and trial is ended. As a result, the trials in this dataset can have variable duration, which is dictated by internal dynamics of the system itself. Within our framework, we can realize previously proposed models of decision-making dynamics, or previously proposed hypotheses. For example, ramping hypothesis would correspond to a linear shape of a potential which have a constant slope, and the slope corresponds to a drift towards the boundary which represents a correct choice. So the noise will drive the particle to the left and to the right, but the drift will consistently push the particle towards the green boundary. So the probability to hit the green boundary is higher. And the latent state will trace out the drift diffusion process. We can also realize within this framework another hypothesis proposed previously, which is a stepping dynamics. Stepping dynamics will correspond to potential which has two barriers. You start in an undecided state in the middle of the domain, and to reach to the decision boundary, you have to jump over the barrier, leading to discontinuous looking behavior in the trajectory. So what we did first we confirmed that using synthetic data from ramping and stepping dynamics, we can recover the shape of these potentials with reasonable amount of data similar to what we would have in an experiment. But of course, ramping and stepping dynamics are just two particular examples people previously come up with. In reality, the decision-making dynamics can be also something completely different, which we didn't think about. And our goal would be to discover from the spiking data the shape of this potential function which controls the decision time course in the monkey's brain. So as I already mentioned, we use the dataset collected by Chandrasekaran and Krishna Shenoy, where they record from dorsal premotor cortex of monkeys using linear microelectrode arrays, which have 16 contacts. So our population will have anywhere between a few and as many as maybe 10 to 16 neurons. And the monkey was engaged in a task where it would look in a static checkerboard stimulus and had to choose red or green target on each trial, depending on the dominant color of the stimulus. And you already saw some example neurons from this data set, and this is again their trial average responses. Some of them show clearly ramping activity, which is considered a canonical decision-making response, but some of them have very complicated time courses, which don't easily fit in neither of simple models discussed previously. So it seemed like our framework would be just ideal to tackle this heterogeneity, because we would learn the model of dynamics at the same time as we will be learning the firing rate functions for each of those neurons, which will correspond to the tuning curves of those neurons to the latent decision state. So we started our analysis by analyzing single neurons in this data set. And here you see an example of a single neuron. This is again its trial average firing rate, or PSTH, for a particular stimulus difficulty. And monkey, for the same stimulus, can make different choices. It can choose left or right. And you can see firing rate of this neuron separates depending on the choice which monkey makes. So when we fitted our framework to this neuron, we found a model of dynamics which was indeed different from both ramping and stepping models proposed previously. We found a potential shape which was smooth and showed a slope similar to a linear slope when going towards a correct choice, in which in this particular case it was a left boundary. And to go to the incorrect right choice, you would have to overcome a small potential barrier. So it's look like smooth ramping towards the correct choice, but overcoming a potential barrier to go to the incorrect decision. And the blue line shows the inferred distribution of initial state, which is in this case on the side of the correct choice. We also learned the firing rate function for this neuron, and you see that when going both to left and right boundary, this neuron will increase its firing rate, but it increases firing rate more when going towards its preferred choice. And this firing rate function has a rather complex profile. Here is an example, another example of neurons which we fitted. And interestingly, although this neuron had very different shape of firing rate function, very non-monotonic firing rate function, the model of dynamics which we recovered from this neuron was very similar to the previous one. It's also had smooth ramping dynamics towards the correct choice and hand to jump over a potential barrier towards the incorrect choice. In total, we analyzed more than 40 neurons from these data sets. They all had very heterogeneous firing rate responses, but for all of those neurons, we would find that dynamics look very close to each other, showing the same consistent trend, ramping towards the correct choice and jumping over the barrier for the incorrect choice. Just to convince you that our model captures the data reasonably well, we quantified the variance explained by our model on single trials. So what we would do, we would, using the fitted model on the training, the model fitted on the training data, we would go to validation data and use this model to predict spiking activity on single trials. And the model was able to account for about 26% of variance in the data. And for comparison, if we estimated or predicted firing rate on validated trials, just using the trial average firing rate or PSTH model, it would account for very small percent of variance. This is because the decision time course is very variable from trial to trial, but PSTH would predict just a single time course, which should apply for all trials universally. And of course, it gives a very poor prediction of variable firing rates of single neurons.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is, I'm not understanding it, but is the reason that you discover the same sort of a latent function just coming from the fact that you've regularized that each feature should be consistent? Whereas if you had taken another approach that the firing rate function should be consistent across the different fits to the data set, you would have recovered the same firing rate function, but different latent functions for, different latent wells. And why is one assumption better than the other, maybe?
Yeah, I just want to clarify that at this point, we fitted each neuron individually and separately, right? So like when fitting one neuron, we would divide data from this neuron into half, and we would want to discover the same potential on both half of the data. It has nothing to do with potential which we learn from a different neuron. So in principle, it is non-trivial whether potential which will be consistent between different partitions of the data for neuron 1 should be the same potential which would explain activity of neuron 2. But nevertheless, you're asking a very good question. We don't have analysis yet, but we are working on it as well. We want to run control analysis where we would like to ask to what extent, if we fixed the potential shape by allowed any arbitrary shape of firing rate function, to what extent can we explain activity of this neuron and vice versa? if we fix the shape of firing rate function can be accounted just by learning the dynamics of the model. So this is a nice control analysis, but we're still working on those.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I build on this question? When, like, my expectation before you showed this slide would have been that you're going to apply this method to many neurons simultaneously, with just assuming that. No, I'm sure you're going to get there.
It's coming.
Yeah, I'm sure you're going to get there, but with the implicit assumption that there is no way you constrain all these parameters from the data from a single neuron, right? That there must be some degeneracy between what's the tuning function, what's the latent state dynamic, but somehow you seem to be able to constrain both reasonably well.
Because this data is very striking. It's not true for all neurons, because in premotor cortex, there are some neurons which aren't called peri-movement neurons. Those neurons stay kind of at their baseline activity for the most duration of the trial, and they only fire a burst of spikes around the time of the decision commitment, around the time of the movement. Since those neurons, they don't really show any decision-related activity, fitting them individually would not give a good result. There is indeed degeneracy because their firing rate just doesn't change. So there are many models which can explain it. But for neurons which modulate their firing rate over the course of a trial, what we find empirically in this data set, it's surprisingly very clear finding, which we find even on the level of individual neurons.
Okay, so then my next question is, you must have some kind of parameterization or non-parameterization, whatever, of either potential or the tuning function, either in terms of like a basis set of basis functions or spline. I mean, some, and maybe I missed it, but could you maybe just elaborate on what your assumption is?
Maybe I think like this setting is a like perfect opportunity for this question, but can I ask that Mikhail will address it so that we have time to finish the talk?
Okay.
Because Mikhail will have entire 2 hours to go into details of how it's actually done. But thank you. All right. So I just want to come back to this question of variance explained. And of course, like the model has 2 parts. We model firing rate of neurons as arising from this latent state, but there is also spiking variability or point process variability, which we cannot predict. So we used an independent method to partition variability of neuron in spiking and firing rate variability. And then we ask how much of the firing rate variability can our model explain, because point process variability is irreducible and not explainable. And it turns out that we only focus on firing rates, and our framework is capable to account for 65% of variance in this data, while PSTH is barely making it to 10%. So now I want to move on to show you an example of how we fitted a population of neurons. In this case, I'm showing you a small population. These are 4 neurons recorded simultaneously while monkey was engaged in decision-making task. And as you can see, these different neurons have heterogeneous trial average firing responses. But when we fitted them individually, all of them showed the same signatures of the latent dynamics. So now we moved on to feed all those neurons simultaneously. So in the model, all of them would have the same shared one-dimensional latent population dynamics, and then simultaneously we reconstruct firing rate functions of each of those neurons. And the finding which we had on the level of neural population was again confirming what we already saw on the level of single neurons. We saw dynamics which would ramp smoothly towards the correct choice, and which would have to overcome a barrier towards the incorrect side. And again, these are functions, firing rate functions reconstructed for this little population, and you see that their tuning profiles are rather heterogeneous. So at this point, it looked like that we discovered dynamics in PMD, which was different from both ramping and stepping hypotheses proposed previously. And we were very interested to understand what this potential means and what can it actually tell us about the mechanism by which decision signals arise in PMD. So we started to think about what does it mean that you have to jump over the barrier only when you make an incorrect choice. And if there are models in the literature, mechanistic models, which would produce this shape of the dynamics. And actually, then we realized there are such a model, and I will show you it on the next slide. So we considered an attractor network model of decision-making proposed back in 2002 by Jiajing Wang. This is a spiky neural network which has two pools of neurons, integrate and fire neurons, recurrently connected, and there are two excitatory populations, and each of these two populations will be tuned for choice. So population 1 will receive input from stimulus pointing towards one choice, and neuron 2 population will receive input from stimulus tuned to the opposite choice. And these two populations compete through the common pool of inhibitory neurons. So when activity in pool 1 is rising, it will create rise in inhibition and suppress activity in pool 2. This model was shown previously in series of papers to capture not only speed and accuracy of decisions, but also the trial average responses of some neurons in the brain which show ramping activity. Here you see firing rate of the population 1. It's actually, in this case, is dynamics on a single trial, but now average over the entire population. And this model also reproduces spike trains, which look similar to some of the neurons in the brain. The caveat, so this model doesn't capture, of course, heterogeneity. So all neurons in the population 1 will have a very similar response, and all of them will be showing ramping activity.
Can I add something to the discussion?
Mm-hmm.
There is actually, I mean, this sort of model, the one you're showing now, it's called push-pull model. And that was proposed by Steven Grossberg back in the 70s. So it's very old, actually.
All right. So
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the spiking realization of this model was published in this paper in 2002. All right, so the mechanism by which this model operates has been studied using mean field approach, and this mechanism is based on attractor dynamics. You can use mean field theory to reduce this model to a two-dimensional system where each variable will represent activity of the two excitatory population in the network. And you can analyze this model in the phase plane to understand in dynamics. So this model will have, in the absence of stimulus, 3 attractor states. And during stimulus presentations, there will be 2 attractor states corresponding to either of the 2 choices, which will be signaled by high activity in only one population. And this is an initial state of the system. The pink dot shows the initial state of the system before stimulus is shown. And the cross shows the settle point, which splits the phase plane into basins of attractor for each of the choice attractor. So for
Tatiana, can I stop you for a second and ask you a question about, so this particular model, why is it exactly this model and not just 2 mutually inhibiting populations? So they're going to arrange probably the same phase plane. So it's going to be exactly the same picture with just 2 mutually inhibiting neurons. So it's called half center oscillator. So I was wondering why there is an extra layer like of complexity. So there are 3 populations instead of just 2.
So I don't want to defend like this particular instantiation of attractor network on the level of how many excitatory or inhibitory populations should be in there. What I want to emphasize now is just the attractor structure of a mechanism by which this model solves the decision-making task. And you are right that like in terms of the number of excitatory and inhibitory population, this solution is not unique. There can be solutions which are based on competing inhibition. There can be solutions where you have also inhibition which is not global but tuned to the choice information. So for the purpose of this talk, it's not important how this attractor mechanism is realized. What is important is how this phase plane look like.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So we use this model as an example of this attractor mechanism. So we have 2 attractors in the system, and they are separated by a settle, and the line here shows a stable manifold of this settle, which serves as a separatrix, so that when you start on one side of this separatrix, you will be attracted by the flow field towards the right attractor. But of course, there is noise in the system. And on some trials, it happens so that the noise will kick you over the separatrix so that you converge to the incorrect choice. And I guess you already see where I'm going with this, because crossing the separatrix is very similar to crossing the potential barrier. Indeed, we can continue this mean field analysis a little bit further, and we can look in unstable manifold of the settle point, which connects the 2 two decision attractors, and we can project the system dynamics on this one-dimensional manifold. And because the dynamics now become one-dimensional, we can describe them with a potential landscape. So we can analytically derive from this model, with some help of a numerical, semi-analytical, it is called, procedure, we can reconstruct the shape of the potential landscape along the manifold connecting these two attractors in the phase plane. And what we get the exact shape, as we found in the PMT data, a shape of the attractor where you smoothly move towards the correct choice, but you jump over the barrier to go to the incorrect side. To push this point a little bit further, we generated synthetic data from the spiky neural network model. And then we used our approach to learn the shape of the attractor on the simulated data from the attractor network. And it was the shape which was very similar to what we found in premotor cortex, both on the level of single neurons and on the level of neural populations.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
So that shape doesn't that depend on the stimulus strength?
Yes, you are right. And I skip over it in my talk, but it is indeed what we find. So we feed each stimulus strength separately. And for different stimulus strengths, we would find different slope in this potential landscape.
And so for zero signal, what does this shape look like? I mean, or do you have a picture of all the other shapes that you get?
Unfortunately, I don't have it in my talk. And I think Mikhail didn't really feed zero strength signal. They only feed weak coherence, but not the zero strength coherence. But the weaker the signal, the shallower becomes the potential landscape. So you're less quickly moving towards the correct choice, and therefore you're more often jumping towards the incorrect choice. All right, so at this point, I would like to conclude my talk. What I showed you today was the framework which we developed, which is flexible and intrinsically interpretable, which allows us to discover neural population dynamics from spikes. I showed you a model selection method based on feature consistency, which can identify model with accurate interpretation. And I showed you that model selection based on generalization cannot do that. And finally, I showed you data which demonstrates the decision-making dynamics in PMD are not consistent with ramping and stepping hypotheses proposed previously, but agree with the attractor network model. At this point, I would like to thank everyone in my lab, in particular Mikhail, who was the person actually doing all this work, and Owen Hughes, who was a summer intern in the lab, who worked with us on the developing decision-making version of the framework. I would like to thank our collaborators, Chant and Krishna, who were very, very helpful through through all the parts of this project. And I would, of course, like to thank our funding sources. And thank you for the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Tatiana. That was a really interesting talk. So we have some time for question and answers now. We had a few questions already, but please maybe just unmute yourself. Jochen, next.
Yeah, hi, Tatiana, great talk, thank you. So quick question, when talking about the potential landscape, you were referring to a correct choice and an incorrect choice, right? So that obviously depends on the stimulus. So does that basically mean that you have to learn different landscapes for different stimuli so that you assume that the dynamics get reconfigured depending on the current sensory input, or how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, you're right. So stimulus dependent is not part of our model now. So therefore, for different stimulus difficulty, we learn a different shape of the potential. But when we optimize model completely separately for different stimulus difficulties, what we notice that the firing rate functions don't change. So it looks like the shape of the potential changes, but we learn all the time the same firing rate function. Therefore, what we end up doing in the end, we have an optimization which is shared across different stimulus strengths. So we learn the firing rate function using all the data, but we have multiple potentials which we learn simultaneously. And each potential will correspond to different stimulus difficulties. So it allows us to see how the slope of this potential changes depending on stimulus strengths.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So also, Tatiana, thank you for the presentation. Have you run sensitivity analysis to see what are the critical parameters in the final model?
Yeah, that's a good question. I feel that was on our to-do list for a while. I don't think we actually ever come to do it systematically. It's definitely something we thought about, but it's not something what we did systematically. What we are doing now with experimental data, we are doing some version of it, which I guess not exactly what you mean, but some version of it, where we, for example, constrain the dynamics to be ramping and stepping, and try to learn just the firing rate function and try to see how much of the data can we explain if we don't allow the dynamics to be flexible.
Yeah, exactly. You can do either that or add, you know, the parameters, change the parameters with a Gaussian distribution, let's say with a certain standard deviation, and then run multiple simulations to see how your results change and compare like the optimized model with those different models and see how it changes. Sorry.
Right, exactly. So this analysis which I mentioned are ongoing, so I don't have really results to show you at this point, but it's definitely something which is on our mind. Yeah, and thank you for the question.
Maybe related, just the other way around. You didn't have error bars on your potentials or on the tuning functions. So how big is the uncertainty given the a realistic amount of data, maybe from one of your collaborators?
Yeah. So this question gets asked a lot. So we ended up developing a procedure for error bars. So for this, we simply use bootstrapping. So what we can do, we can just, let's say we have a set of trials, we can sample trials with replacement to generate multiple versions of data. And we can repeat the whole model fitting and model selection procedure on each of the bootstrap sample. And then we can get an error bars around our potentials and firing rate functions. On synthetic, we tested it on synthetic data. It's in the paper which is about to come out in Nature Communication shortly, where we talk about synthetic data in decision-making dynamics. And on synthetic data, it looks great. It's something which we are still working on in real data, so I don't have you unfortunately plots to show this.
Maybe follow up on this. So, I mean, it's a fundamentally different way of doing model selection than the classic way of imposing a prior in a Bayesian framework or regularizer, and then choosing the right hyperparameters. So have you done a systematic comparison of your method with such a method in your context to see what their pros and cons are?
Yeah, definitely. So it's in the paper, it's in 2020 paper, which was mentioned on the slide. So what we did was to choose dynamics of different complexity. Let's say simple potential will give you simple dynamics. If you have many wells, we will have more complex trajectories, obviously. So we can use ground truth dynamics of different complexity, and we can use also different amounts of data, right? So we can have just a small data set or gradually increase the amount of data. And we investigated the ability of our method to discover the correct model as a function of amount of data and the complexity of the ground truth dynamics. And we did the same for the classical model selection method based on validation. So what we found that, of course, if dynamics are complex and we don't have sufficient data, we can underfit, right? So the model starts to develop spurious features before it learns all the correct features of the dynamics. So this is what happens if you have little data and very complex ground truths. But the approach of using feature consistency is conservative. So what we prevent the model to overfit, which very often happens with flexible models, and validation-based model selection. Because what it turns out, and there have been other work in the field showing the same thing, that if you have a very flexible model, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Belkin, they talk about like interpolation threshold. If your model is so flexible and kind of operating this regime, like the model complexity is so high that it can develop spurious feature, feed every single data wiggle in your training set, meaning completely overfit to noise, and nevertheless have the great generalization performance. So what we combat with our method is a problem of this what it was also called in machine learning benign overfitting. But of course, we can underfit, and at these points, we don't know. We can only discover as much from the data, what the data allows us to discover. So it's still a possibility that dynamics maybe are more complex, but we just have not sufficient data to reliably learn those more complex features.
Thank you. Any other questions? If there are no other questions, I suggest we have a short break, maybe maximum 5 minutes, while Mikhail is setting up. And then Mikhail is going to take us through the tutorial. And of course, there's going to be plenty of more chances to ask questions on anything that you didn't get a chance to ask right now. So thanks a lot, Tatiana, for the great talk. And we'll see everybody again in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, see you.
Okay, so I think we should continue. Thanks, Mikhail, for taking us through the tutorial in the next couple of hours. I think we have to go to some Colab link. Is it the one that's on your website, on the slide?
Yes, yes, yes. Let me actually copy paste it into chat for your convenience. One moment. So this is the link. And then if I open chat. Yeah, I copy pasted it into chat. But you don't have to open it right now, because I will start with the presentations and you will go to Colab, and then we will be coming back and forth. I have I split it into 5 small parts. So first I will give a background, and then we will do it in Colab, and then we'll do part 1, part 2, and so on. Yeah. Should I start now? Or?
Okay, great, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the tutorial, and thank you to organizers for this opportunity to present. Yeah, it's my first tutorial, so yeah, let's see how it goes. Yeah, and feel free to interrupt me at any time if something goes wrong, or if you have a question or anything like that. So today I will introduce you. You will get familiar with our Python package, Neural Flow. It is available on GitHub. This is an open repository. You can access it at any time if you are interested. Yeah, and we will do, like, this tutorial is split into 5 parts. So first I will give you a background with the slides, and then we will do the exercises in Google Colab. And you need to have your Google account. You need to be signed in. If you are not signed in, it will ask you to sign in. So hopefully everyone has a Gmail, like Google account or Gmail. Yeah. Okay, let's start. Okay, just to remind you about our framework details. So in our framework, we have this latent dynamics, which is, by the way, can you see my cursor on the screen? Okay, good. So we have this latent dynamics, which is controlled, which is governed by this general dynamical system equation. So in Tatiana's slide, it was force, f of x. Here I replace it with a potential derivative, which is the same thing. So force is a negative derivative of potential. So we have a deterministic part that comes from this potential function phi of x, and we also have a Gaussian white noise. So at each trial, we start at the latent state x of t0, sampled from this p0 of x distribution. So this p0 of x is another component of our latent dynamics along with potential function. And then we have some latent dynamics, so a population dynamics generated from this potential function. So for example, if we have something close to a ramping dynamics with a linear potential, our trajectory may look like this. So if we analyze decision making, then each trial will end on the decision boundary, either left or right. So here when we first time reach right decision boundary, our trial ends. And then for each of our neurons, we have, if we have n neurons, then we will have n firing rate functions. And these firing rate functions, f1 of x, f2 of x, and so on, will give the firing rate of each neuron. So at each point of time, firing rate depends on this like latent state, and the actual rate is given by each neuron's firing rate function. And then the spikes come from this inhomogeneous Poisson process with the given rates. Yeah. Okay. So what kind of problems we want to address, or what kind of problems we want to solve with our package? First is a spike data generation problem. So if you have a model, so the model consists of 4 components: potential function, noise magnitude D, all of the firing rate function, and P0 effect distribution. So given a model theta, generate spike data y of t for each neuron on like each trial. The second is model inference. So given spike data y of t, find the model, find all 4 components of a model that are most consistent with the data. And yeah, we developed the method to like infer all 4 components simultaneously, but in this tutorial, I will only focus on inference of model potential. So when I talk about a model, you can just think about a particular potential function. And the last problem is model selection. So given this like sequence of models produced by gradient descent, select the model that accurately approximates the dynamics in the data. Okay, so part 1, data format. So if you want to use our package with your own data, first thing you need to do is to prepare your data and to convert it into the format that is accepted by our package. So let's imagine that you have your spike data. Our framework works with continuous times, so we don't bin the time axis. So in this case, one of the natural formats for you to use would be this like spike times format, where you simply remember the spike times of all neurons at all trials. So for each trial, you will have this like 2-dimensional list of all of the spike times for each neuron. And here you can see an example with 3 neurons. And you also need to know trial start time and trial end time. Okay. So this would be one way to have your data. But if you want to use our package, you have to convert it into the, I will refer to it as the ISI format. So ISI is the interspike interval. So what you need to do, you need to take your data, you need to collapse all the spike times into a single sequence, sorted like this. So we start from trial start, then we have the first spike, second spike, third spike, and so on. And instead of writing this long list of spike times, instead you write down the ISI, so interspike intervals. So the first interval would be between the first spike and trial start time, and it will be delta T1. The second interspike interval is between the second spike and the first spike, so it's delta T2, and so on. But this is not sufficient. You also need to know which neuron, which spike comes from which neuron, right? So you also need to remember the identities of these like neurons that spike. So for the delta T1 interval, it's between trial start and neuron and the green neuron, which is neuron number 1. So here I write 1. The first ID is 1. The second spike was emitted by neuron number 0, so I write 0 here, and so on. And the last entry would be -1, which tells us that the last event is trial end. So for each trial, you will need to convert your data into this ISI format, where for each trial you have 2 sequences. First is all of the ISIs in order, and second is the corresponding identities of the neurons, and -1 in the end, which tells us that trial ends. Okay, now let's do the first exercise in Google Colab. So what I suggest you to do is to have 2 windows next to each other. Like maybe let me show you. So one window will be with my presentation in Zoom, and the second window will be your browser. So if you can make it like if you can place 2 windows next to each other, that would be ideal for the tutorial. So please open the chat, copy paste the link, and please go to our GitHub repository. And let me know if anyone has any like problems with that, like if there are any difficulties. So now when you open our repository, you should scroll down So there is a README file displayed here, and you should scroll down all the way to tutorial part. Now let me do it like, let me expand this window into a full screen. And now let's do the first part. So here you have a button, open and call up. I prefer to do it in a new tab so that like our package will be on this tab. Our GitHub will be on this tab, and then you have your exercise 1 here, right? Okay, let me guide you. So here I have a lot of text written just so that you can understand it by yourself. But for this tutorial, let me guide you through this notebook. So the first exercise would be to convert the data into our ISI format that I talked about. So let's just execute these cells one by one. So the first cell installs our package. You see here this command pip install and then our NeuroFlow package. And it also creates a data directory in your local folder. And it will download like a file that you need for this exercise, a pickle file. And if you are not signed into your Google account, it will ask you to like sign in. You can just, if you have a Gmail, just use your Gmail account to sign in. Okay, hopefully everyone was able to successfully install this NeuroFlow package and to download this like part1 spike times data.pickle. Okay, next cell is just to import the packages that we use. So here we will use, in addition to our package NeuroFlow, we will also use NumPy, Matplotlib to visualize the data, also SciPy and Pickle. Okay, so here, like I call this cell 1, which contains the actual code. So here, what we will do,
Mikhail,
yes,
you may want to pause a moment for those people who actually follow along. Like I'm following along, and you know, it just takes it takes a bit of time to kind of press the button, wait for Google to execute, and then switch back and forth attention to your window, you know, local window.
Yeah, so Tatiana told me that the best thing to do would be to have 2 windows next to each other, and then you can see my window and you can do it in your browser window next to each other.
I still have to switch attention. Even if I have two screens, I'm doing everything you're saying, but still.
You're right. Thank you. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. Let me wait for 1 minute. And yeah, again, if you have any difficulties, feel free to ask me. Yeah,
okay, exactly. So anyone else, if something is going too fast, you know, just please speak up, because the whole purpose is not for you to simply watch Mikhail do something on the screen, but to, you know, follow along. And
there is, by the way, an alternative way to do this tutorial. For the future, if you want to do it in offline regime, you can also clone this GitHub repository and do it locally in your Jupyter notebook thingy. But in this case, like it's not like industry quality package. I didn't test it on like Windows and Ubuntu and many other things. So there might be some difficulties. You might want to search for particular versions of the packages that are compatible with our package. So that's why like call-up is preferable, yeah. Okay, yeah, I assume that everyone was able to open the call-up and to run the installation and importing cells. Okay, so cell 1. So here we will load the data in the spike times format, which I talked about. So here is like this line. We already downloaded this pickle file from our GitHub repository that I prepared for you with the data in a spike time format. And now we will load it. We will extract the spike times and the trial end times. Here, I assume that all trials start at time 0. I don't have trial starts, I only have trial ends. And we will print some information about the spikes. So I will print like that, how many neurons it contains, how many trials, and I will print some of the spike times on a particular trial for a particular neuron, right? So here I also have like line 15 is where you need to insert your code. So you have to complete the line 15. So actually I wanted to have a break here. I wanted to give like 3 minutes to people so that they can read through the cell and understand what should be, how to complete line 15. So let me give you like another 3 minutes or so, right? Okay. Let me actually set up a timer. It will be easier. Yep. So here your goal is to print spike times of a neuron with ID 1 at trial 3. Now it's none, so it prints none. But you need to replace none with a relevant piece of code. Yeah, it's very easy. So it's not like a Python challenge. I just did it so that to make sure everyone understands what's going on. If you don't have a Python experience, if you never program Python, then probably you will not be able to do these exercises. I apologize for that. We only have a Python implementation. We don't have alternative implementations. So.
Hal, one quick question. I'm just out of curiosity, if you had a very, very large population of neurons here and you have neurons that are firing, that just happen to fire at the same time, maybe you have multi-units, how will that, will prepping the data, or would that be an issue at all?
Thank you. Yes, that's actually a good question. Honestly, I don't remember for sure. I had this with real data. So when I have this real data, the precision of the spike time is like 1 millisecond, so maybe 1/10 of a millisecond, and some of the spikes happen exactly at the same time. I think it's better to filter it. So you just, if like 2 or more spikes happen at the same time, you just, if n spikes happen at the same time, you select n-1 of them randomly and you just remove them. Also, yeah.
I mean, couldn't you just subsample at 0.1 milliseconds and then give an arbitrary time?
Yeah, although it will be a bad idea probably, because each neuron, yes, has its firing rate function, so it can affect the results. So maybe the safest option would be just to add a very, very, very small number, like fractions of like milliseconds, like microseconds, let's say. It will not affect the results, but it will. I don't remember honestly how this package would handle 0 ISIs. So if one of your ISIs is 0, I think it will handle it correctly, but I'm not exactly sure. It may raise an exception in this version. But thank you very much for bringing this up. It's actually, yeah, it's an important thing. I mean, yeah. Okay, so yeah, 3 minutes is almost over. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention. So the useful feature in Google Colab, you can point at a variable after you run the cell. You can point at a variable, and it will give you some info about it. One moment. So, for example, here the spike data is a dictionary with 2 items. First is trial end time, which is like array with shape 5, and the next one is like spikes. And now when I extracted it, my spike times is an array with shape 3, 5, and my trial ends time is an array with shape 5. So yeah. So the way I pack the data here is that I'm sorry, yeah, I should have said that. I planned to say it before, but yeah, I forgot. Okay, so the way I pack the data here is that the spike times array will have the shape of number of neurons by number of trials. So here we have 3 neurons and 5 trials. And then trial end time will have the shape of just number of trials. So for each trial, this will just record the trial end time. And for spike times, for each trial and each neuron, it will have a list of its, or array of its spike times. So if I want to print how many neurons I have, I just call spike times dot shape of 0, which is the first, which is like number of rows in the spike times array. And number of trials will be spike times dot shape of 1, which is number of columns in this array, right? So if I want to print trial start time at trial 3, I just call trial ends of 3, right? Or maybe it will be, or maybe I should do a trial end of 2. It depends on whether you start counting from 0 or from 1, right? And then if I want to print the spike times of a neuron 0 at trial 3, I will just call spike times of 0 and 3. So if I want to print spike times of a neuron 1 at trial 3, I will just do the same thing, but here instead of 0, I will ask to print. I will have 1 here. So
now I'm confused. But your ISI format, I thought, put all the spikes into one long vector from all the neurons. It didn't split according to neuron. I thought the neuron ID vector gave you the identity.
That's correct. I'm sorry for the confusion. This is a spike times format. It's not ISI format yet. So in this exercise, what I want you to say, let's say you have your own data and you want to analyze it with our package. And your data is probably packed differently. It's not in the ISI format. Let's imagine you have the spike times format. So for each neuron on each trial, you have the spike times. And you also know trial start, which is 0 here, and trial end times. So this is your data that you have. And you want to use it with our package. So first thing you need to do is to convert it into the ISI format. And we will do it in this cell. So let's convert the spike data into the ISI format, right? Okay, in order to do it, you can use our package. So in our package, what you will always do, you will use our EnergyModel class. And this class contains all of the relevant variables and methods that you need. I will talk about it in more details in the next part. But for now, let's just create a variable of this EnergyModel class with an empty input, just a variable. Because what we want to do, we just want to use the method to convert spike data into the ISI format. And this method, it's written here. It's called transform spikes to ISI. So it has two parameters. First is the spikes, which will be like this array of spike times of all neurons at all trials. And the second one is time epoch. So time epoch is a list of tuples, one for each trial, and each tuple will contain trial start time and trial end time. So this is exactly what we had in cell 1. We have the spike times in the spikes array, and we need to have trial start time and trial end time. So in order to use this method, first I need, I already have my spikes, right? It's already loaded and prepared, but I need this time epoch list. So what I had this trial ends array, which just contains all the trial ends. And my trials, they all start at 0. So to do this time epoch list, I just say it will be a dictionary that will consist of tuples, and each tuple will consist of trial start time, which is 0, and trial end time, which you should take from the trial ends array. So this is a list comprehension. This is like a short form to create lists in Python. Yeah. And then I just use this method to convert spike times data into the ISI format. So I say my data ISI will be equal to em.transform spikes to ISI of spike times and time epoch. So this data ISI will be our data packed in the ISI format. And now I want you to print a couple of statements about this data ISI format. So let me give you another 3 minutes to read through this print statement, to understand them, and to complete line 20 of this cell. Okay. Tatiana, if I forget anything, you can also remind me. Yeah, because I don't know. Yeah.
Or maybe if people have difficulties, they can just ask.
Yes. Yeah. So for each cell, I actually have a document, I have some markdown cells here that have more detailed documentation. So if you are interested in this tutorial in our package, you can open this tutorial in offline regime and read the markdown cells and do it by yourself. We also have the examples in our GitHub repository. Yeah. But because we are doing this in online regime, I kind of going through it very quickly. So some people may have difficulties, to understand this. Yeah, so I have a timer. I will wait for 3 minutes. You can read these print statements and try to complete line 20. This is a little bit more tricky here. Here I want you to plot the sorted spike times, but using the data ISI array. So you have ISIs, and you can use this cumulative sum function, which is numpy or NP here, because we imported numpy as NP. Now, NP comes sum, which can calculate your spike times from the ISIs, right? And by the way, one other thing is that this Colab works like Jupyter Notebook. So you can, for example, create a new cell with the code, and here you can experiment, you can try something. For example, I don't know, I can print the spike times of neural 0 and trial 0, and I can only print, let's say, the first spike times, right? And then I can print the data SI, also at trial 0. But this, yeah, I mean, you can create new cell and you can just experiment something. Yeah, I'm not doing anything very meaningful. Maybe you want to use print. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, 3 minutes passed, so let me just go through it. So now we converted our data into the ISI format. So in ISI format, let's see, it will be an array of shape 5, 2. So 5, the first shape is the number of trials, which is 5 in our data. And the second dimension is always 2, because we have 2 sequences, the ISI sequence and the sequence of IDs for each trial. So if I want to print number of trials, I just say data ISI.shape of 0. For number of neurons, it will be a little trickier. If you really want to count number of neurons, you will have to calculate the number of unique identities in each sequence on each trial. So you just need to remember it. We have 3 neurons here, right? Now at trial 3, if I want to print the ISIs from all of the neurons, right? Now we mix them up in a single sequence. I just call data ISI of 3 and 0. And if I want to print the corresponding neuron IDs, I just call data ISI at trial 3 and 1. And so I have here, I have all of the ISIs. They will be small, right? I mean, if you're, yeah, it depends on how your spikes are separated. But yeah, here they are like small, they're in seconds. And here we have the corresponding neural IDs. And this sequence ends with -1, which tells me the last ISI is between the last spike and the trial end time. And now if I want at trial 3, if I want to print the sorted spike times of all neurons. So here, by calling data ISI of 3 and 0, I would print just the ISIs, right, in the spike intervals. And to convert it into sorted spike times, I take CumSum, which will calculate me the cumulative sum of the sequence. And then, yeah, here I will have the increasing spike times of each neuron. Okay, yeah. So one thing I forgot to mention to you is the reason why do we use this ISI format. It's not because we are lazy and we traditionally implemented it like this. This is because of the way our framework optimizes the data. So when we do a model optimization, we process this data spike by spike. Like we process the time, we march forward in time, and whenever we see a spike, we immediately use this information that we observe a spike at this particular time. And actually, like the absolute times are not very relevant for us. What's relevant are the ISIs, the time differences between the spikes of each neuron. So the reason why we need to format the data in this, why we need to convert the data in this format is because it is like optimal for the model inference. Okay, now hopefully everyone was able to finish this part. Let's go to part 2. So I will open my presentation again. Yeah. You can close this call-up exercise. We will not need it anymore in this tutorial. So let's go to part 2. So in part 2, I will introduce you with our EnergyModel class. So in our package, this EnergyModel class is the main class that you should always use whenever you want to do something with our package. So it will contain all of the relevant variables, like the framework components, model potential, firing rate functions, P0 of X distribution, also the latent domain, grid points, and all of the methods that you need for data generation, model optimization, and model selection. And following the question that was asked to Tatiana about the discretization of the function, right? So what we do, we like analytically, we work with continuous function. So we derive, actually, when we optimize our framework, we derive the expressions for the likelihood and for the gradients in terms of continuous function. But then we need to evaluate it numerically, right? And in computer, of course, we use a finite discretization. So we use a finite set of basis function. And here, like, I will not cover it in this tutorial because it's like an implementation detail, but we used Langevin, Langevin polynomials, like Langevin interpolating polynomials as a basis function. So we have like, actually you will see it. For this class, you will have to choose number of grid points. Let's say I want to work with 1,000 grid points. And then each of your functions will be represented by a 1,000-dimensional vector, where each value will be a value of this function at this grid point because of how like Lagrange interpolation polynomials work. Yeah. Okay, and there is one more detail, like one more technical detail I wanted to share with you. It's useful if you want to use our package. So the model potential can be actually represented in 3 equivalent ways. We can use a phi of x function, the potential function that you saw on Tatiana's slide. We can also represent it with the driving force, f of x, and driving force is just a negative derivative of potential. So I can either remember potential or I can remember the driving force, and I can find the second value from the first. And the third way is this, I will call it pec of x function. It actually has some physical meaning, but I will not go into too much details like we have it in our article. But the thing is, this pec of x function, you can find it from the potential. So if I know potential, I can calculate this pec of x. It's actually a distribution, so it's always positive and it integrates to 1. So if I know the potential function, I can find this pec of x distribution. Or if I know pec of x distribution, I can find the potential. And the reason I'm sharing this information with you is because in our class, we store the potential by storing pec of x function. So you will not have direct access to potential. You will have access to this pec of x function. And then you can calculate the potential from it by taking negative log. And the reason, again, is like the way we optimize the framework. It's convenient for us to store it in terms of pec of x. This is for numerical efficiency.
So remind us, the polynomials that you're using to basically as basis functions for your potential. So you're using them as a basis function for potential or for the PEQ, PEQ?
For everything. Any function is represented in terms of this like Lagrange interpolation polynomials.
And they come, they're in increasing order, right? So do you have some kind of prior built-in favoring lower orders over higher orders, or is this automatically discovered, or does it get penalized by your complexity function?
So first of all, I don't think Lagrange polynomials have an order really. If you have, let's say, 8 points, you have 8 Lagrange polynomials. Each of them will be equal to 1 at its own grid point, and it will be 0 at all other points, right? So it's not like I have like linear, quadratic, and cubic.
So they're localized. So
They're localized, exactly, yeah.
Okay.
But yes, of course, like if I, for example, if I have a very complicated dynamics, very complicated model, and I only choose very poor grid resolution, I will not be able to discover it because I cannot represent it on a grid, right? So usually what we do, we choose a large resolution such that, like if you have 1,000 points, in principle, you can have like 1,000 attractors, so maybe 500 attractors. So we usually work with a sufficiently large resolution such that it is not a limiting factor. The limiting factor is usually the data. Like I don't have enough spikes, or like my dynamics is not too complex. Yeah. Sorry.
Why didn't you just use splines or something?
Or Taylor functions, for example.
Well, Taylor, I mean, there's a lot of benefit to having something localized, but.
Well, it's like, so in order to optimize a model, we need to solve this like vector eigenvalue problem. So, and we do it using spectral elements method. It just, I don't know, we just read in the book, they suggest to use Lagrange polynomials. In principle, you can use different eigenfunctions. So, but this one works very well for our purposes. So,
okay.
Yeah. Taylor, yeah, Taylor is rarely used actually in numerical methods. Yeah. Fourier would have these restrictions that you have periodic values, right? This thing does not have any like restrictions, so it works well. Okay, so, oh, I forgot to. Okay, now let's go to a call-up. Let's go to a tutorial. So once again, you open your browser. I will close exercise 1. We don't need it anymore. You open our GitHub repository, and then you click this button for part 2, open and call up. I will open it in a new tab. Right. Okay, this is a second exercise. So again, I have this like markdown cells with some detailed explanation, and I will guide you through this cell as before. So this is not a full, this is just some short version of documentation of our EnergyModel class. So we can have the following parameters here: number of neurons, which is like number of neurons we want to work with. If I have 10 neurons in my data, I will set it to 10, right? Then we have the spec model. So this can be a dictionary or a lambda function, and this will define our pec of x function, which defines the potential function, right? So we offer some like we predefine some some models, and you can use our predefined models to specify the potential function. And I will show you the details later. It just, the point is that you can use one of our predefined function, or you can write your own lambda function to initialize the pec of x and potential. And the same applies to P0 of x distribution. It's initialized by P0 model parameter. D0 initializes the noise magnitude, or we also call it diffusion. Firing model initializes the firing rate functions for all neurons. We also have, so I will give you more details later, so don't worry about it now. Then there is a boundary mode parameter. So this specifies the boundary mode that you want to work with. So you can either specify absorbent boundary, in which case it's like to model decision-making dynamics, for example, in which case trial will terminate at the boundary, or you can specify reflecting boundary, in which case you will be reflected from the domain boundaries, and your trial will stop whenever you tell it to stop. And also there is this, we call it PD solve param. This is our parameters for solving the PD, partial differential equation. And the reason I brought it up here is because here you can control the number of grid points, the dimensionality of your latent, like not dimensionality of your latent state, but number of grid points in your latent state. So here, one detail is that we use the spectral elements method. And for spectral elements, your grid actually consists of finite number of elements, and each element can have variable number of points. So you have to specify two parameters. First is NP, which is number of points per element, and then is NE, which is number of elements. And then the total number of grid points will be NP minus 1 by NE plus 1. So it's roughly a product of these two quantities, but because elements overlap at one point, it will be a little bit less. It's let's just go through this notebook, and you will understand it better. And when we create a class, so the class instance will be created with the following attributes. There are actually more attributes, but the important ones that you need to be aware of are the following: n, total number of grid points; x, d, which is an array of grid points of the latent domain. So here we don't use a uniform grid. If you would use a finite difference method, you would probably have a uniform grid. But the spectral elements method, the grid is not uniform. So you really need to know the location of each of your x points. Then there is this spec with underscore attribute, which is this spec of x function evaluated at grid points. And the same is for P0 of x function. There is also noise magnitude, which is just a number. And there is a fair function, which will be a two-dimensional array of the size n by number of neurons, where n is number of grid points. So it will contain all of the firing rate functions for all neurons evaluated at grid points. Let's just see. Let's just try to complete this notebook. So we start with installing the package. Because it's a new notebook, you need to install the package again. I'm not sure if you can actually install it once and for all in Colab. But yeah, I didn't find the way to do this. So each time I open the new exercise, I need to install a package. And here I import the packages. So let me wait for just 1 minute for you to make sure that everyone has like installed the package and imported all the packages. Here we'll just use our package, NumPy, and matplotlib. That's it. And also grid spec. It's for like fancy subplots visualization. Yeah.
So are you the only one giving support to the package?
Say it again, please.
Are you the only one giving support to the package?
Basically, yeah, currently, yes. You can also contact Tatiana Engel. She will probably ask me. Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm the only one. Yeah.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, there are lots of things. I wanted to do it perfectly, but
yeah, it's a lot of work. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, but it's getting bigger and bigger. We implement more and more functions, and it's getting a bit messy. I realize I have lots of typos in docstring. Yeah.
No, but it's good. It's good. Congratulations, man.
Thank you. Okay, let me go on. So assuming everyone has installed and imported the packages, let's go to cell 1 with the code. So here I specify my EnergyModel parameters with the dictionary. So let's specify the ramping dynamics. So I want to work with two neurons, two neural responses. My PEC model would be ramping. The ramping model corresponds to a linear potential. So here I use a predefined model. And if you want to see the full list of all the predefined models, I should have documented it, but I didn't. So you can find it in a special file in the source folder, which is not how you should do the package. But we have this file called PEC models, which contained all of the predefined model. We have cosine squared, PEC of x, we have cosine to the fourth power. This is stepping model, what else? Linear potential, single well, double well, and so on. Sorry for the distraction. So here I want to work with a linear potential. My P0 of x distribution will be a single well with some parameters. So this will define me a very narrow center P0 of x distribution. You will see it in a minute. This is my noise magnitude, 0.56, whatever. Then I have this firing rate function for all of the neurons. So here I want to work. So my first neuron will have a linear firing rate function with slope 50 and bias 60. You will see it. So it will be just y is equal to fixed 50 multiplied by x plus 60. And my second neuron will have a nonlinear firing rate function, which will be of sinusoidal shape with a certain bias and amplitude. I want to work with absorbing boundary condition because I want to model decision making. And my PD solve parameter. So this thing should be unchanged. So the only method that we have is like ACM, spectral elements method. And this will determine the size of my latent domain. So here I use 8 points per element and 64 elements. And verbose will just print a bunch of messages during optimization.
So for the fighting model, so can you pick, let's say you have 10 neurons. So can I pick different non-linearities for each neuron?
Yes. So here you see I have this list of models, one for each neuron. So if I want 10 neurons, I will put 10 here, right? And then I will continue with my list. I will enter the model for the third neuron.
I get it. Okay. And you also have like the sigmoid function and things like that, right?
Sigmoid I don't have, but I will show you how to use your own lambda function. So you can write sigmoid function.
No, I know how to do it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Mikhail, if I was thinking about using a package like this with you know, dozens and dozens of neurons from arrays, so we would have to indicate there's no default model, for example. Every single neuron has to have its own firing model.
No, there is no default model, but I can show you how I do it. So if you want to optimize a model, these parameters will be initial guess for each neuron, right? So usually what I do, I use the same initial guesses for all of the neurons.
Okay.
So what I do usually, I do this. Let's say I have 100 neurons, so I will set it to 100. And then what I do, I will comment out this line, and I will just do this. So this will create me a list of 100 identical dictionaries.
Yeah, I see.
Cool.
Yeah. Now let me delete it and let me come back to the tutorial example. So,
but just to double check, right now we're just in the process of generating synthetic data, right? We're not fitting any real data yet.
Yeah, for synthetic data, you have to specify each neuron's model.
Of course.
But again, you can do it in automated fashion. So you can, I mean, creating a list of dictionaries can be done in a for loop before, right? It's not like
but later we're going to get to the point. Once I have my set of data, how can I fit the model?
Exactly.
Okay, good.
Okay, so let's just evaluate this cell. So first I specify all the parameters, then I create an instance of EnergyModel class with these specified parameters. And here 2 stars means like unpack my dictionary. These are actually the inputs, right? And then I print some statements about my model. So my model has em.numNeuron neural responses. The total number of grid points is 449. And I can change it like these 2 values. And then the noise magnitude, I said it's none, but actually how much time do I have left? Maybe I should accelerate a little bit, right, Tatiana?
I honestly don't know.
Do you know how much time?
Officially, we go till 2 p.m., so 45 minutes.
45 minutes.
But we can go a little longer, as Ralph said.
I see. Okay.
Yeah,
so
we started a little later, so yeah.
Yeah. Let me accelerate a little bit so that you will have your time like to explore it by yourself. Okay, so let me just put it here. So here I wanted you to put em.d underscore, or you can put em.d0 too. Now they're the same. It's like the noise magnitude. I had it in the description of the class. Okay, so I print our model has 2 neural responses. Here is the total number of grid points, and here is the noise magnitude. Now let's actually plot the potential function, P0 of X distribution, and the firing rate function for these 2 neurons that we just initialized, right? So here I have like figure, I create a subplot. Here I set up like titles, X label, Y label. It's not that important. The important thing is like where I plot it, right? So to plot potential function, I plot my latent domain, which is em.xd versus negative log of pec of X function, as I said before. So I have my pec PEC underscore in as my class variable. If I want to plot a potential, I take negative log of it. This is just implementation detail. Now to plot P0 of X distribution on a different subplot, I plot again my latent domain against em.P0. To plot, so my firing rates are stored in this variable em.fr, which will have the shape n, number of grid points by number of neurons. So in order to plot the response, the first neuron's firing rate function f1 of x, I plot em.x against em.fr, like I plot all the row and the zeros column. And here I want you to plot the firing rate function of the second neuron, f2 of x. So can you complete line 39? Let me just wait maybe 2 minutes. It's not difficult, but I mean, yeah. And when you run it, you will see the plots of all of your functions. So here is a potential function, which is linear, as I promised. P0 of X distribution, which is like narrow and centered in the center of the domain. Firing rate function of the first neuron was linear. And it is this, like my latent state, by the way, by default, it goes from -1 to 1. It's not that important, like how you choose the boundaries of your latent state. It can be from -100 to 100 or from -1 to 1. It doesn't matter that much. So I always use from -1 to 1. Yeah. So if my firing rate function is like 50x plus 60, then at x equal to -1, the firing rate will be 10 hertz. At x equal to 1, it will be 50x plus 60, it will be 110 hertz, right? This is what you see. And to plot the firing rate function of the second neuron, what I do, I just copy paste, I uncomment this line. I had to comment it because it does not plot nonce. And then I just change this thing to 1. So I take the whole row and the first column. And then when I execute it, you can see the firing rate function of the second neuron, which is nonlinear here, right? Okay, now the last thing I wanted to do in this part is to play with the parameters. So you can specify different values for different parameters, right? For example, for like PEC model, which specifies the potential, you can use different models. For example, we have this double well potential that Tatiana showed you in her presentation. But let me actually, let me do it with my lambda function. So what I can do, I can specify the PEC of X function with a lambda function. So for example, and yeah, feel free to do it by yourself. So I will talk, I will do it in my window, you can do it in your window, you can do different things. So let's say I want to create my own potential. Oh, sorry. So I will say my PEC model will be lambda x. So I need to specify it. I actually need a lambda function that depends on x, depends on the latent state, right? And it will be 2 minus x squared. By the way, do you know how to do it? If let's say you want to work with a particular potential and it is only defined at certain grid points. So you don't know the functional form of it. It's not like x squared or x cubed, but you only know it at some of the grid points. Do you know how to specify lambda function for it? There is I will show it to you actually in the next part. There is a cool thing. It's from SciPy package. It's called SciPy interpolate. So you can create an interpolation object that will be as a lambda function, and it will interpolate you in between the grid points. And just like random thing, not random, but useful thing. Sorry. Yeah. So let me plot this thing with a custom. Oh, I'm sorry. This is P0 model. Actually, I wanted to replace the PEC model with this. I wanted to create a potential with a custom lambda function. And now if I rerun cell 2, if I rerun cell 2, okay, now my potential is like some custom quadratic potential. So it's not, it is not equal. So here I set it to 2 minus x squared, but this is peak of x, right? And the potential will be log of this. So it's not actually a quadratic potential, it's log of 2 minus x squared. I don't know, something else. And if you want to do a quadratic potential, you need to do exponent, right? So if I want to do, I probably need to do something like this, np.exp. I'm not sure it will work, by the way. I didn't practice it. So maybe it will fail. Maybe I did something wrong. Let me see. Oh no, look, it works. Now it's truly quadratic potential because my peak of x is exponential. So when I take log, I just have this minus x squared, right? Cool. The same thing you can do for firing rate function. You can choose different models, or you can do it with a lambda function. So yeah, you can change the grid resolution, you can change number of neurons, you can change the noise magnitude. Here it will be just a number. So yeah, I think that's it for this tutorial. Let's go to the next part because we are short on time. But again, yeah, you can set up this class variable with your own parameters. So it's pretty flexible. Okay, now let's go to part 3. I will close this notebook unless you have a question, of course. Now let's go to part 3. Okay, part 3 is about synthetic data generation. So here I just wanted you to briefly outline how we generate the data, just some implementation basics. So let's say we have a model. So we know all the components. We know P0 of x, potential function, all the firing rate function, and we want to generate the data, let's say on 100 trials. So there are 2 steps in data generation. First thing, we need to generate these latent trajectories. So on each trial, we first sample x from a given distribution P0 of x, and we will have like a bunch of blue points, 1 for each trial. And then we numerically integrate this like nonlinear stochastic equation. And we do it using just Euler-Maruyama method. So it's just Euler method where you take care of the square root scaling for noise. So we integrate these trajectories, and then we also handle the boundary dynamics correctly. If we have a reflecting boundary, whenever our particle jumps from the domain, we put it back and at a certain distance, such that it seems like it reflected from the wall. If we have an absorbing dynamics, if we jump out of the domain, that's it, trial terminates. So this way we can generate latent trajectories, 1 for each trial, for reflecting or absorbing dynamics. And then we need to generate spike data for each neuron. And this is a very common problem. So if we know the latent trajectories, we can take the firing rate functions from this latent trajectory, and then we will know the firing rate, time-dependent firing rate for each neuron. Lambda 1 of t, lambda 2 of t, and so on. And then we just generate spikes from a given rate of inhomogeneous Poisson process. I will not comment how we do it. It's a well-known problem, and yeah, there are many books.
Excuse me, the boundary dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get it. Does that emerge from the equation or the method, the Euler-Maruyama method creates that boundary artificially?
So at this point, when we need to generate data, the boundary dynamics comes into play as follows. You see this equation. So here I integrate my x, right? So I have xt, I integrated and I obtain x at time t plus 1. And I keep going. I go along the trajectory. And then at some point, my xt plus 1 just jumped out of the domain. And then I take care of it. So if it jumped out of the domain, then I do one of these 2 actions, depending on which type of dynamics I want. So here I just do it like I manually handle the boundary dynamics. But when we will do model inference, we will handle it differently. It will be in the equations, and yeah. But for data generation, you just manually, like you just follow your protocol depending on which boundary dynamics you have. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's basically it. So let's come back to the tutorial again. So now I go to part 3, and I open it in Colab. Okay, in order to generate the data, we have a method for it. And this is our class method. So it's called EnergyModel.generateData. So it will generate data from the parameters that you specified in a class. Like we already saw how to specify. We like to call it not parameters, but maybe components, potential, P0 of X, and so on. And in addition to that, you need to specify two parameters. First is delta T, which will be a time step for integration of the latent trajectory. You just set it to some small value to make sure your integrations results are accurate. And then there is a time epoch variable. This is a list of tuples. I already mentioned it in part 1. So it will be a list, and for each trial, it will contain a tuple with trial start time and trial stop time. So let me just walk you through this notebook as before. Let's run the first two cells to install the package and to import the packages that we use.
I have a question. You use an incredibly small step size. Is that a bottleneck, a computational bottleneck for your method? Or I mean, I think you used like 10 to the -2 or 10 to the -3 milliseconds.
That's true. Yeah, it's because just this is, you know, this is integration of a latent trajectory. So for latent trajectory, we wanted to integrate accurately. But in terms of computational bottlenecks, usually data generation takes very little amount of time. I do it on my local machine.
But then when you
a lot of time is optimization, and in optimization, I don't have this parameter anymore.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I confused that. Good point.
But in practice, it depends on your model. So if your potential has lots of small attractors, then you need to have a small step size. Otherwise, the small attractors will be kind of ignored because of the large time steps. If you have just like a single well potential, you can use the large time step. It will not matter that much. Yeah. Okay, so I assume everyone installed the package again and imported these packages, NumPy, SciPy, Matplotlib, and NeuroFlow package. Okay, now here I create an instance of EnergyModel class as before with a ramping dynamics. So here the parameters are the same as it was on the previous exercise. So I just created. I initialize my variable, which I will call EM data gen, because I will use it for data generation, right? Then I specify number of trials. Here I want to create 100 trials. I can do more or less. And then I create it. So here, one thing I forgot to mention to you about this time epoch variable. The thing is, I told you it contains trial start and trial end for each trial, right? But if you work with absorbing dynamics, the trial end time will be determined by a system. So in this case, this like trial end will be a timeout. So it's a maximum allowed time for a trial to last. So usually if I want all trials to terminate on the boundary, I just give it very generous timeout. 50 seconds is very generous for this dynamics because the average trial duration is like 500 milliseconds or 0.5 seconds. So 50 seconds, it will never last 50 seconds. Okay, so again, here I create a variable with a ramping dynamics and I generate 100 trials from it. So this class, this like method generate data, it returns me like 3 parameters. It's actually 4, but the last one is not important, so I just put an underscore. Okay, the first parameter is data ISI, which will be my IS data in ISI format. The second one is time beans. It's just an array of all the time beans for each latent trajectory, and the latent trajectory, which are like all the generated latent trajectories, if you want to look at it. Yeah. Okay, so hopefully everyone ran the cell 1 and you saw the progress bar and you generated 100 trials. Now let's go to cell 2. So in cell 2, I visualize the latent trajectory. So I just generated 100 trials. I don't want to visualize 100 latent trajectories. Instead, what I did here, I selected 4 trials, 2 with the shortest duration and 2 with the longest duration. let's not go into the details. It's just very simple Python computation, how you sort the trial duration array, select first two elements, second two elements. Let's just run the cell. So here I select 4 trials. 2 of them will be with the shortest duration, 2 of them with the longest duration. And I plot my latent trajectory on these trials with different colors. So the green and blue one corresponds to the 2 trials with the longest duration, and the red and pink one corresponds to 2 trials with the shortest duration. So here you can see this latent trajectory plotted across time, right? I think for the sake to save time, because I will not go through the code, it's very simple, but I just don't want you to waste time on this simple Python manipulation. Let's just go on. So in this cell, what I do, I plot, let me just run it. I plot the firing rate of a second neuron with nonlinear response along these 4 trials. So what was the lambda of t? What was the firing rate of the second neuron? And actually, in order to plot the firing rate, I need to take my firing rate function from this x of t. And one problem is that my firing rate function is only defined at grid points. But this latent trajectory x of t can take arbitrary values because I use Euler method. It doesn't care about my grid. So I need to interpolate my firing rate function to the whole x domain. And you can do this using this scipy interpolate interp1d functions that I mentioned before. So again, let's not go through the details. I can just plot the firing rate of a neuron 2 along these 4 selected trials. And the last thing that I plot the spike raster of the second neuron at these 4 trials. And you can look at the code, how you can plot spike rasters. So let's actually, so make sure you run all the cells. So cell 1, cell 2, cell 3, and cell 4. So in cell 5, I just put all these pictures together. It's the same pictures that we had before. They're just like, I plot them next to each other. So here, the purpose of this task, I just want you to look at this and make sure it makes sense. So here, I plot, in the top subplot, I plot this firing rate function, or not firing rate function, I'm sorry, firing rates of the second neuron on 4 trials. And on the bottom plot, I plot the spike rasters from this neuron. So let's, for example, focus on a blue trial here, on a dark blue trial. So here you can see, like, between the time 0.5 and 1, in my case, the firing rate was small and I observed small number of spikes. But then when the firing rate is large, like at time between 1 and 2 seconds, I observe many spikes. It makes sense visually. It always helps to visually inspect the data and make sure it makes sense to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Mikhail. Can I ask you a question? I've tried to set up the noise parameter to 0, and so I would expect to see some smooth dynamics just to test your code and see if there are going to be some smooth, I don't know, latent trajectory. So I've tried to run this, and it just shows me some error and says D has to be positive.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
And moreover, I've tried to set it to a very small number, and it just the code runs very slowly, so it takes like 11 minutes to complete. So I was thinking about what could be the reason behind this behavior.
I mean, yes. So one thing I didn't take care of is zero noise magnitude. Usually you would need some finite noise magnitude. So I actually have this like checking function that checks whether the parameters are valid, and it says if D is less or equal to 0, it's invalid. And regarding the small noise, I don't know.
I think it's absorbing boundary. So it never reaches the boundary. So you're simulating very many, very long trials.
Exactly.
Yeah,
it will eventually complete, but yeah.
Yeah, it has to be with the numerical. It has to be with the numerical solver.
It's not a problem of a solver of anything. It's just like problem of parameters, because we set it up to be dynamics which needs to reach the boundary for trial to stop. But because you put very small noise and there is also very small drift, eventually you will get there, but like the trials will be very long. So it takes you a lot of time to simulate them.
You can also you can reduce the timeout also, but then some of your trials will stop at timeout at arbitrary latent state.
But Mikhail, just as a suggestion, I mean, in real experiments, there is no 50-second timeout. In real experiments, right, in reaction time task, you may have a 1 or 2 second timeout.
Oh, sure, yeah, of course.
So if you want to generate more realistic synthetic data, you should make that value much smaller anyway, and then you'll solve that.
That's a good point. Thank you. Okay, so I had one more cell here, and this is about, so here I just select one trial, like the one with the longest duration, and I plotted the firing rates of neuron 1 and neuron 2 along this trial. So I plot f1 of x of t and f2 of x of t. I just wanted you to emphasize that these neurons can have different firing rates and actually can have like seemingly different dynamics. For example, this red neuron, you can see it's like oscillates around 40 hertz, but this blue neuron, it goes silent, completely silent. Even though they were generated from the same dynamics, because they have different firing rate function, the spike patterns can be very different, right? So that's just one thing to emphasize.
So maybe to try to channel the more experimentally minded people here, maybe we should move on to the fitting actual data.
Yes,
rather than generating synthetic data is fun for us theoreticians, but
I agree, yeah. Let's move to part 4, which is model inference. So let me close this thing and let me open my presentation. Okay, now let me talk about model inference. Okay, so we have the spike data. Our goal is to find the model components most consistent with this data. And here again, I will focus on potential function. But the rest of the components, we know how to optimize it as well. And now we are working on the publication where we optimize everything. Like Tatiana already showed you some preliminary results from this decision-making data. We find noise magnitude, we find potential, we find P0 of x, we find the firing rate functions, we find everything. But let's focus on potential. Let's say we know all the firing rate function, we know P0 of x, we know d, we are interested in the potential. So to find the potential most consistent with the data, we use maximum likelihood inference. So the likelihood is a function of both data and the model, and it is defined as a conditional probability of observing a certain data given a model. So our goal is to maximize it with respect to theta. So we want to find a model that has the largest probability of generating this given data, right? And we do it. So what I'm not saying here is how to, let's say I know the data and I have some current guess for the model. How do I find the likelihood? It's actually like we have a lot of analytical derivations, how to find it. You can look at the supplementary information and into methods of our papers. We have 2 papers, how to do it. But we derived the analytical expression for the likelihood and for the variational derivatives of the likelihoods with respect to framework components. So here we are interested in fitting potential, but there are actually some numerical difficulties to optimize the potential directly. So instead of optimizing the potential, we optimize the driving force, F. So we use our analytical results to calculate the variational derivative of the likelihood with respect to the driving force. And then we have some current guess or initial guess first of this driving force, and then we update it iteratively with gradient descent. And let me give you a little bit more details on the gradient descent. So on each iteration, given the data and the current guess for the driving force, f old of x, we calculate the likelihood and the variational derivative. So the reason we need likelihood is because we want to keep track of the cost function. We need to make sure it's decreasing, like Tatiana showed you the plots, and you will actually generate the plot by yourself. And then we use the variational derivative to make the gradient descent step. So we calculate the new force by marching marching towards the by using this like variational derivative of the gradient. I hope everyone is familiar with gradient descent. And here we have this parameter gamma f, which is a learning rate. which is a hyperparameter that we can change in order to speed up or slow down optimization. And we need to tune it every time because yeah, we need to find the best best learning rate. And one thing to remind you is that here we work with continuous function. So our f-hold will be some continuous function. Our variational derivative is also a continuous function. And then we sum it up with some learning rate, and we obtain a new driving force, which will be a different continuous function, right? So as Tatiana already showed you before, the optimization will look like this. Here I plot the cost function versus iteration number. You see it's decreasing. And here I plot my potential. So here I generated my ground truth from this double well potential. And I start my optimization with a single well potential. And you can see how this potential in red changes and converges towards the ground truth. And now let's do it ourselves. Let's go back to Colab, to tutorial. So now you need to open part 4 in Colab. Okay, so to do the inference, you will use our method called fit. And in addition to all of the framework components and the data, it will also it will have two parameters. First parameter is optimizer, which should always be equal to gradient descent for this.
Mikhail, your font is a little bit small.
Well, thank you. Yeah, yeah, I will make it 300%. Thank you. Okay, so in this fit method, we have two parameters. First is the optimizer, which in current versions, it's only gradient descent, but I also have Adam optimizer, but I did not publish it yet, so but it's coming. And the second parameter is options, which is a dictionary with all of the options. So the relevant options for this tutorial are like data, which can include training data, which has to include training data always, and optionally it can also include validation data if you want to calculate validation cost function. And also it has this optimization dictionary, which can have like many options, but the two relevant are gamma, which is a dictionary that specifies the learning rates. I will show it to you later. And also it has the maximum iteration, which is like number of iterations that you want to do with gradient descent. And it will return you like the fitted energy model class. So let's just, to save time, let's just start doing this notebook. So we need to install the package and we need to import the packages first. Okay, so to demonstrate, okay, let me wait 1 minute to make sure everyone imported the package and installed it, or maybe 30 seconds, yeah.
Okay, while we're waiting, I have a couple of questions. So right now, what you're going to show us is, or what Tatiana showed in the talk, when fitting to individual neurons, inferred both the tuning to the latent and the evolution of the latent itself. Is that correct?
Sorry, what's that? Can you ask it again?
So what Tatiana presented was inferring both the tuning function
and the
evolution of the latent simultaneously.
Yes.
And that's what you're showing us as well now, or you're just showing us assuming one and inferring the other?
Yes. So what we will do, we will generate synthetic data, and we will assume we know the tuning function, and we actually know it for the case of synthetic data. So I will just provide the correct values for the firing rate function, and we will only optimize the potential, just the latent. It's just for simplicity. Actually, in this version of the package, I don't have this option to optimize the firing rates. I can only optimize potential, noise magnitude, and P0 effects. But like we are working on this publication with the real data, with PMD data, decision-making data. And when we are done, I will publish the new version of a package where you can optimize everything. You can fix something at any value and optimize just some of the components, or you can optimize all of the components at once. it's your choice. Yeah.
Because that's, I mean, before this becomes practically relevant, you need to be able to fit both simultaneously, right?
That's true. But actually, for the first paper, when we didn't fit the firing rate function, what we did, like we just assumed linear firing rate function. So we fitted this data where the monkey stares at the screen and the activity transition from a low activity to high activity states. It's from Engel's Science 2016 paper, this data. So we just assume linear firing rate function where we have like low activity on the left, high activity on the right. And then we found this like attractor model. But
so,
this,
yeah, I want to comment on this actually, Ralph. It's actually a very good point. So you say to correctly identify latent dynamics, it is necessary to fit all the components. You want to fit dynamics, but you also want to fit the relationship between dynamics and firing rate, which can be nonlinear. I have to point out that most of the methods which we currently have and use in computational neuroscience for learning latent dynamics don't learn arbitrary shape of firing rate function. Usually we assume that there is a linear relationship or maybe a ReLU relationship between latent state and emission. And the only thing you would optimize maybe the slope of your ReLU relationship. So this component of our framework to be able to reconstruct the nonlinear tuning curve is very new.
Yeah. But in this tutorial, we will only optimize potential function. So let's do it. So in cell number 1, I again initialize my rampant dynamics like we did before, and I generate 50 trials of data from it with this linear and nonlinear neurons. With this like 2 neurons that have linear and nonlinear firing rate functions. So let's just complete cell 1. You already seen it. So we now have this data ISI, which is the training data. Okay, in order to optimize the model, we need another instance of EnergyModel class. And this instance will be the same as the ground truth, but the PEC model will be different. So here, instead of linear potential, I say my PEC model will be uniform. Uniform is a constant PEC, so the potential will also be constant, negative log of constant. So this will serve as an initial guess. So my framework knows the correct noise magnitude, it knows the correct firing rate functions, it knows the correct P0 of X, but my potential, my initial guess for the potential is a uniform potential. It doesn't know it. And I create a EM fitting. It will be the EnergyModel class that we will use for fitting. So now let's try to learn the potential, right? Assuming that we know all of the other parameters perfectly. Okay, now let's learn it. So first of all, so yeah, just run cell 2 first. And now let's go to cell 3. So first we need to define these hyperparameters for optimization, which are learning rate and number of iteration. Can you actually set learning rate to 0.3? Because if I set learning rate to very high value, it will just print you an error, because if you march very far, you're like you kind of can go outside of the domain of possible functions. Like maybe you're, yeah, it just you will have some numerical issues and there can be an error. So let's just set it to 0.3. Number of iteration, let's set it to 10. Then we need to pack this parameter into this options dictionary, and here I do it. It's yeah. And then I just say, oh, I initialize my fitting variable again here. It's just for convenience, because if you want to rerun this with different parameters, I just need to reset it. And then I just say fit it with the gradient descent algorithm and with the given option. So let's run the cell. So now we do the optimization. And we have this progress bar. We do it for 10 iterations, right? Let's wait for it. And it returns you like fitted class. It's not, yeah, it's really like, okay, let's not point attention to the output. And in cell 4, I plot the results. So if you run the cell 4, you can look at the code, but if you run it, you will see your cost function versus iteration number, and you will also see the potentials across different iterations. So here at iteration 0, my initial guess is a constant potential. And then you see it evolves towards the ground truth potential, which is a linear one. Here I only have 50 trials of data, so my results are not very good. I also only fit it for 10 iteration, and maybe you need to tune other hyperparameters. So don't it shouldn't bother you that the results do not look perfect. So the fitted potential does not perfectly overlap with the ground truth, right? It's just to demonstrate you that you can do it by yourself. Now, what would happen? So some of you may see that the cost function does not decrease. Some of you may see that it oscillates. So each of you generate your own data sample, right? So all of you will see different results depending on the nuances in the data. Does anyone see that their cost function is oscillating?
Yeah, in my case, it goes up sometimes.
Yeah. So the reason is that the learning rate is too large. For example, let me actually redo it with the learning rate equal to 0.5. Let me just show you what will happen. So if your learning rate is too large, your cost function may not be decreasing. It may oscillate just because your step is too high. This is very common in gradient descent optimization.
I think it's called overshooting, right?
Yeah, maybe overshooting. I'm not sure. Yeah. Okay, well, here. So I set my learning rate to 0.5, and look what I have. My cost function does not decrease, and my fitted potential is all over the place, right? It goes to some very high values. It's some nonsense, right?
They call overshooting in the machine learning community, I think.
Maybe. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Okay, yeah, so here we observe overshooting. And if you choose your learning rate to very small value, then you will never, your optimization will last forever, right? So you need to tune this hyperparameter. That's the point. And that's it actually for this thing. So this is a very simple, minimal demonstration of model optimization. But yeah, this gamma here, it can be changed. You can also say, for F, I will have this learning rate, but I also want to optimize D. And for D, I will have another learning rate. And then you can optimize both force and noise magnitude simultaneously. And you can also optimize P0, but I will not demonstrate it here, just, yeah, for the sake of time. Okay, did everyone see the pictures? Do you have any questions? We still have one part left, so with feature consistency analysis. Yeah, so in our package, we offer many different options and hyperparameters and stuff like that. So this is just one example. And yeah, if you're interested in more, you should look at our GitHub. Okay, so let's go to part 5 now. And part 5 is this feature consistency analysis for model selection. Okay, so as Tatiana mentioned in her talk, we can do this gradient descent for many iterations, and eventually we will overfit, even though our cost function will still be decreasing. So if you know where to stop, like at iteration 50, you can obtain a very good fit. But if we work with the real data, we don't know the ground truth, right? So we will not know what model is correct. This one, like at iteration 13, at iteration 50, or maybe this one at iteration 31,000, right? So we need to have a model selection tool to select the models that accurately approximate the dynamics. And as Tatiana explained, there are many traditional machine learning tools to do that. And nearly all of them are based on regularization. And you choose your hyperparameters by validation. And if you just wanted to generate spike data, like new spike data with a given statistic, that would work very well. But if our goal is to find the correct model with a correct number of attractors, that accurately approximates the dynamics in the data, this validation-based method often overfit, and they're not reliable. So we developed our own feature consistency analysis method. So in order to, I will explain it now again, because you probably forgot the details. So it relies, our feature consistency method relies on the notion of feature complexity. So feature complexity is a functional that quantifies how complex are the model features. here we only focus on potential. So I will not give you a precise mathematical definition, how we like define it, how we compute it numerically, but the intuition is the following. Sorry, intuition behind it is the following. If you have very simple potential, like flat potential, your feature complexity will be low, like 0 for a flat potential, or maybe like 2.5 for a single well potential. But for more complicated potentials with more features, your feature complexity will increase. So for like for this potential, the feature complexity is 11.3. So if we optimize our model with gradient descent, take each model and calculate its feature complexity, and then we plot this feature complexity against the iteration number, we will see that this feature complexity is increasing. And the reason we need it is because for each data sample, this optimization like speed will be different. Sometimes we will obtain the good model very fast, like in 10 iterations. Sometimes we'll obtain it in like only like 30,000 iterations. So we need this feature complexity really to align the models from 2 data samples. So let me remind you how we do feature consistency analysis. We take our data, we split it into 2 data samples, data 1 and data 2. Usually they are of equal size. Let's say even trials go to data sample 1, odd trials go to data sample 2. And then we optimize a model on each of these data samples independently with gradient descent. Then we take these like sequences of models produced from gradient descent, and we calculate their feature complexities. And we'll observe something like this. So feature complexity for both data samples will increase with iteration number. And then the idea of our feature consistency method is to visualize 2 models on each level of feature complexity and to compare them directly. So when we, in the beginning of the optimization for small feature complexities, our model will tightly overlap. So here you don't even see the red potential from the second data sample because they completely overlap very well. Yeah. Then as we continue our optimization, the models will still overlap, and at some point they will overlap with the ground truth. And if we keep fitting, we will start to infer the noise features. And the noise features are different for 2 data samples. So our models will disagree when we start fitting the noise features. And our idea is, if you don't imagine, I don't know the ground truth, right? I don't know this gray curve. But the idea is to stop the optimization at the point when 2 potentials start to diverge. So when you start to diverge, it means you start fitting noise. That's it, you need to stop. And like we just need to quantitatively, we just need a quantitative measure of how well the potentials agree for this thing. And we come up with this, it's called JS divergence or Jensen-Shannon divergence between the 2 like latent distributions that correspond to these model potentials. So this, I'm sorry, I'm saying too much words maybe, but this is just a metric of how similar are 2 potentials. If 2 potentials are very similar, this like divergence will be almost 0. If 2 potentials are like very different, the divergence will be large. So what we do, like algorithmically, in order to select the correct model, we just impose a fixed threshold on this divergence. And then whenever we hit this threshold, we stop the optimization. And we say, okay, here is the correct model.
Quick question. Where does the threshold come from?
It's from numerical experiments with synthetic data.
But it's also not so important, like where, because like if you look in this curve of JS divergence as a function of feature complexity, the divergence is pretty much flat. It's very low as long as your models agree. And at some point, it starts to rise sharply. You can move this threshold a little bit up or a little bit down. It will slightly change your result, but it will not change your result in a dramatic way, right? Because look how, and this is really different by putting some threshold on generalization accuracy of your model. Because we're really comparing features in this case. So it's not about like how low your likelihood is, it's to what level do the potentials agree.
So it seems to me it's closely related to your uncertainty over the potential.
It is.
Right? So essentially you have an uncertainty in my inference versus log likelihood trade-off. And you're finding some point that from your perspective, optimizes kind of like in, both objectives, right? Yep. So, I mean, the JS divergence is basically a measure for how different those two curves are, which is basically what you would be getting if you were doing bootstrapping on your method, which is basically what gives you the uncertainty over your estimate of the potential.
It's not exactly like bootstrapping, right? Because like each gradient optimization run returns you 10,000 models, right? So you need to also kind of on each run of gradient descent converge on one of those models.
Okay, but that's a separate issue, right? I mean, so conditioned on the same data, there is a global, optimum.
There is not, because as long as you run gradient descent optimization, we never really saw optimization stopping ever. The likelihood will always decrease as long as we have compute power to fit the model.
Also, you can regularize the cost function directly. In this case, you will achieve a global optimum. But
then you picked a very precise optimization, regularization strengths, and how did you pick that parameter?
But then when we try to tune this regularization strengths, oftentimes it tells us that 0 is the best choice. So we don't need to regularize.
But hold on. I mean, there is a global minimum. Your method may not find it, right? You may not be able to converge to it either because of local minima or because you have a finite step that doesn't take you exactly there. But that's it's
a very, very generic property, like of very high dimensional optimization problems, even neural networks. If you just hook up feed-forward neural network and try to fit it to some data, the optimization curves would look very similar to what you saw in my talk. Like they keep decreasing. And there is actually very relevant work in physics by Jorge Cruchan, who would argue that like these high dimensional landscapes have very particular properties, and falling in high dimensions, like all our intuitions which you have about what does it mean to descend a landscape, a cost function landscape, all our intuitions from low dimensions are very wrong if our optimization problem is very high dimensional. So to reach a global minimum, like in some particular classes of models, would take you the time greater than the age of the universe.
Of course, it'll, I mean, sure.
So it's kind of doesn't make a point to talk about like perfect convergence. So as a result of this, you run your gradient descent and you have a sequence of models which come from basically how patient you was to wait, like how many iterations do you want to run? And then like it's no objective way to say where you need to stop along this continuum, because the likelihood would decrease in most cases, and even validated likelihood may be still decreasing even in the last iteration which you run.
Sure, but I think you're confounding two errors here, right? One is, okay, I haven't converged to the exact global minimum given my model class, given the data. And the other one,
and we know we already overfitted at that point. Even we didn't converge, but we already overfitted.
Sure. I mean, that's why I'm saying conditioned on a finite set of data. And that's a different source of error from the source of error that you only have finite data, right? So you have a different data set. That's another term.
Yes.
But anyway, I mean, it seems to me that what you do, that this is really closely related to, in the end. Okay, let's take this offline. We should probably come to an end here. So.
Yeah, I think you are right. So the reason we need all this stuff, because you have a finite data, so your potential will never overlap completely. They only completely overlap at iteration 0 if you have the same initial guess. Then they diverge. So you need to allow some threshold. You need to allow some of this thing. And you're right, we are trading off kind of the uncertainty versus, how far we can go. If we choose this threshold too low, there is a risk that we will not infer the correct features in the dynamics because they diverge too early, right? Because of the nuances.
It's a bias variance trade-off, right? That you have here.
Well, yeah, no, I would argue that it's not, but maybe we should take it offline. Like, I guess, like in our paper, we argue that we are working in a regime where bias variance trade-off doesn't hold anymore.
Yeah, but yeah, maybe let's finish the tutorial and then we can have a discussion. Maybe. Yeah, with those who are interested. Yeah. Okay, there is one technical detail I wanted to mention to you. So the way I told you is that like we optimize the sequence of models. We optimize the model on data set 1, we optimize the models on data set 2, we obtain 2 sequences of models, and then we select a pair for each level of feature complexity. We select a pair of model and we compare them. In reality, this is not quite what we do. What we do exactly, for each level of feature complexity, we select one model from sequence 1 and we compare it with several models from sequence 2, because we allow some slack in feature complexity. This is also related to nuances in the data and uncertainty of our method. And the reason I want to bring it up here is because in the code we have these parameters that control the slack. So it's not maybe conceptually it's not very important. It's just a technical numerical implementation of this feature consistency analysis. So with that in mind, let's go to the tutorial, to the last part. Okay.
Maybe if I could just stop here, since we're a few minutes over time, if there are questions from anyone, because we want to be, I mean, we'll keep this call open for additional questions and for Mikhail to go through the last part. But for those who have to leave, I just want to make a bit of space for any kind of questions, comments.
Okay.
If not, let's go on.
Yeah, let's just continue. Okay, so to do feature consistency analysis, we have this function. It's actually not a part of an EnergyModel class. It's just additional like utility function. So it will have the following inputs: data 1, which will be a sequence of models optimized on data sample 1. Data 2, which will be a sequence of models optimized on data sample 2. Also, we need this EnergyModel instance that we use for fitting, because we still need to know like the noise magnitude, the P0 effect distribution. So we just need the instance that we use for fitting, either of them actually, doesn't matter which one. Also, we need, I have here iteration indices. This is a technical thing. It's just like if you have 10,000 models and 10,000 models, this thing will take too long time, but you can do it for only consider certain models with certain indices. And we also have this FC stride parameter, which controls how many models we compare on each step. It's like the slack and feature complexity that I said on the last slide. And it will return you the feature complexity and this JS divergent curves. And then you can threshold it and find the optimal model. So, and also it will return the indices of the models for each level of feature complexity in this data 1 and data 2 arrays. This you need for visualization. It's like, yeah, it's not a big deal. So let's just install the package and import necessary packages. So here, I already did the optimization for you. So I took my data generated from a ramping model. I split my data sample into 2 parts. I optimized 2 model, like I optimized my model on 2 data samples, and I saved them in a pickle format. And here you will load these 2 sequences of models. It's because like I did it on 10,000 iterations. So in online regime, it will take too much time to wait for 10,000 iterations. It will take like a day. So here what we do, we initialize a variable of EnergyModel class that I use for fitting. So it has like uniform potential and some other parameters. Here I actually have just 1 neuron. Yeah. And then I load my optimization results on these 2 data samples. And I also generate this ground truth potential because I will need to visualize it for you. So first of all, let's not go over this cell. It's just a cell with plotting. So here I just plotted this picture that you've seen in my presentation and Tatiana's presentation. So this I plotted this optimization results. So here I have this ramping dynamics. I start from a uniform potential, and here how it changes. So first on iteration 50, it closely like overlaps with the ground truth. So we discover the correct model. But then if you go on iteration 10,000, you see it's overfitted, right? So I already explained this. And here you have training and validation post-function. Okay, and in cell 3, you will perform this feature consistency analysis. So basically what I do, I set this like stride parameter, which will determine how many comparisons I have. I say that I want to work with just 100 of models from both sequences. So not 10,000, just 100. I find the indices of these models, and I actually arrange them on a logarithmic scale to cover the whole space of different feature complexities. And then I just call my function feature consistency analysis. And now I have this JS versus FC curve. And then in cell 4, so you see it's very fast to compute. If you just consider 100 models, this cell like it runs in like 5 seconds. And then cell 4 plots you the results. So here you have an interactive plot. If you run this cell, I have a slide bar here. So what you can do, you can change your feature complexity. You see here a purple point is the current feature complexity that you can move with your slider. And then you can see the corresponding models in red and blue on the bottom. And also there is a ground truth model in black, the rampant dynamics. So you can see that initially our models tightly overlap. My JS divergence is low, but as I go on, like here, I think would be a good point to stop. Like here, I impose this threshold. Threshold here, it doesn't do anything, it's just a dashed line. And if I go beyond that, my models, you see, they start to diverge, right? There are oscillations, yes, and they start to diverge. And my JS divergence increases. So you can just play with this slider just to see how it works. Yeah. And that's it. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please ask them. Yeah, you can contact us by email. You can always access the GitHub repository. It is opened. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Mikhail, that was super useful. From my perspective, I'm looking forward to the joint fitting. Especially, so my question is, can you right now at least fit a linear function jointly with the offset and the slope?
It's not in the package currently, but it's very easy to implement. Instead of optimizing this continuous thing, you have 2 parameters and you calculate gradient with respect to 2 parameters, slope and bias. It's very easy to implement, but we didn't do it because it's not our immediate goal.
Well, but it's a special case. No, it's a special case of inferring the tuning function. You're inferring a linear tuning function.
Maybe actually, yeah, you're right. Maybe it's useful to have this functionality in the package that you can impose a certain parametric form and then find the parameters. Yeah, maybe it's a useful thing. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good idea. Actually. Yeah, you're right. It's useful. Sometimes you want to restrict your firing rate function to a specific shape. You say, I want it to be linear. Maybe you have too few amount of data and you don't want to.
Exactly. And you may have some information about what from prior work.
Oh, that's also true. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
I have lots of questions, but I really like anyone else, please speak up. Any other thoughts, questions, particular on the tutorial part?
I have just a really brief one, and I'm just curious. I understand. So first of all, a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot. It's very easy to use. I really like this. So I can't wait to start playing with it, with our data. One quick question that I would have is, at this point as you developed this package, you had some data sets. Did you ever have any specific data sets where that were derived, say, from the same population of neurons with different tasks, for example? And if that was the case, what would we expect to change in terms of the potential functions for that individual neuron across tasks? Would we expect something entirely different or something to remain the same across those data sets?
I mean, I expect it to be different. Even, when you have different stimuli strengths, your potentials will be different. And if you consider different tasks, then yeah, I expect it to be different. But yes, in terms of real data, we only analyzed 2 data sets. For the first paper with monkey staring at the screen, and for the second, this decision-making dynamics. And that is it. for the real data. We did not analyze anything yet so far. Yeah.
So, and the reason that I asked that is that I'm trying to get a sense of what is it, you know, imagine that we can do this online. You know, we use microelectroarrays, we can do we can get the spikes, we can do the data right away and get the fits. What would be an interesting way to then validate the findings, or to say, okay, well, now we have this latent tuning function, and now we have this new data set or this new experiment. Would we be able to use this as a way to predict the responses of a given neuron in a different context? And that would be fun to try, I guess. But
yeah, that would be fun to try. One interesting finding, as we find in decision-making data, is this firing rate function. They really the same across conditions. So we prefer to think about firing rate function as like individual property of a neuron, how it responds to a latent population state, to a state of the rest network. So if these firing rate functions were the same across tasks, I think that would be a very cool thing to check. Yeah.
I'd be very surprised.
Me too. Also, you know, these are continuous functions, so they may be approximately the same, but then you need to define what is the same, right? Yeah, it's also like yeah.
I mean, that was one of the aspects of the results that really impressed me the most and surprised me the most, is that you could get a seemingly reliable estimate of the potential from individual neurons, and that they agreed so well from neuron to neuron. I think that gives me a great hope that, you know, you're discovering something profound. I mean, I would have been, one of my questions would have been, look, if you apply this to one area, to 50 neurons or 100 neurons to population, and then to another area, do you expect to see the same potential? But if you even find the same potential from, I mean, it could be that there are bigger differences from area to area than from neuron to neuron within the same area. But it seems to me that the latent state that you're simulating or that you're inferring here is so tightly tied to the task that it should be shared across the brain, even if you're doing a sensory area which was receiving feedback or whatever. In principle, you should be, you know, recovering the same potential. Which
not necessarily, right? So I think, like, if you look within the area, maybe yes. If you start to look across areas, maybe no. For example, based on Carlos Brody work, they use slightly different approach, right? They don't have the exact same flexibility as we have, but even like with their type of models, they were already able to pull out that some cortical areas work more like integrators of sensory systems, of sensory input, while other areas perform kind of more categorical choice, right? Kind of the type of integration process or the dynamics of the decision process can vary from area to area. So I'm really looking forward to find there is a final commitment to decision, which most likely doesn't happen in one area at a time, and how the entire brain comes to this commitment. I don't think like we really as a field have a good picture of it now.
But in your framework, I would have expected that the difference, but let's say if you think about, you know, a sensory area representing momentary area evidence, a decision-making area just integrating linearly, classic, I don't know, sequential ratio test, and then a third commitment motor area that has a more, you know, stepwise response. To me, that seems to be reflected in your tuning function, right? Where one, let's say the decision-making area is linearly related maybe to the latent variable, while the motor area, the neurons there, have tuning functions that are more stepwise, that are basically, you know, either or, if that are tuned to, you know, having exceeded the latent having exceeded a threshold. Am I misunderstanding something? I mean, I think you could account for both kinds of behavior, categorical, non-categorical, with the same latent dynamic, but with different link functions to the neural responses.
I'm not exactly sure that that's the case, right? Because like, as we know, you can maybe capture, because we only kind of on a high level have the speed and accuracy of decisions, right? Is the output, right? And you know that the same distribution of speeds and accuracy, we can construct slightly different models to capture it. So even if all areas are constrained by this global behavioral speed and accuracy relationship, the dynamics in them can unfold in slightly different way. So I don't think that necessarily the diversity only comes from firing rate functions. I don't know, Mikhail, maybe you have a different view.
Yeah, it's hard to say, but I can see your point. And yes, your hypothesis may be also correct. We actually have a way to check it, sort of. So we can analyze one area independently, another area independently, and then maybe analyze them all together, assuming that there is a common latent state, and then see how the results agree, right? But yeah, I can imagine that, yeah, both of these hypotheses can be correct. So I cannot, yeah, I don't know.
Okay. So that touches on one of the things that I'm not totally sure about yet in your framework is what kind of degeneracies exist between the latent state dynamic and the tuning function, right? They're clearly two separate components, but to what degree can the same neural spiking, how can it be, consistent with different combinations of those two? And the fact that you can seemingly reliably recover the latent state, potential and the tuning function from individual neurons suggests to me that you really can, they're really dissociable.
There is no degeneracy. Yeah, there is no degeneracy in the model, like at least in one dimension, at least like what we have been doing so far. The parameterization which we use is identifiable.
So if that's the case, then it seems to me that if the difference between, let's say, continuous representation of the decision variable versus a more categorical representation, if that can be captured in a tuning function, then it cannot also be captured with the latent dynamics, right? If it's truly identifiable.
Yeah, I feel like we are doing these experiments, these fittings right now, right? I mentioned it in the talk that Mikhail is working now on constraining the model of dynamics, try to capture as much as we can with a tuning function and see how far we can go, and vice versa. I don't really know that. I don't think we really have results at this point, but
yeah, I didn't even start it. Yeah,
it's something we have on our to-do list, but I guess it's too early for us to.
But yeah, let's say we obtain this like potentials that Tatiana showed with one attractor, like with ramping towards correct side and jumping towards incorrect side. What if we replace it with a ramping dynamics that matches the behavior, right? Matches the distribution of reaction times and correct side. Can we find a new firing rate function, like a new one, a nonlinear one that will accurately describe it? And how well we will, like our basic metrics, like how well is, we evaluate our fits using like this variance explain thing, and also how well we predict the behavior. So we can actually, yes, try all these different alternatives and see, is it really like, are both of them important, or is it only potentials that is important, or is it only firing rate? Or like if or is our framework degenerate, let's say?
Well, no, in theory, it's not degenerate. In theory, it is identifiable, but I guess in practice, it's a separate question. That's why we want to do all these simulations.
Well, in theory, also assuming that firing rate function is not like constant. If it's constant, obviously you cannot define anything.
Yes.
Anywhere you go, your firing rate is the same. So you don't really care. Yeah.
Okay, great. Any more questions? If not, thank you so much again. Cool, interesting, educational, learned a lot. I look forward to reading more about it, applying it myself. And I think so let me officially close the CCN conference part of this meeting, and just remind everybody that there's going to be one more event next Friday on the usefulness of representations, one of these GACs. But otherwise, maybe see you in person next year at CCN. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye.
Thank you. Excellent session.